Annie Phillips wanted out of a bad relationship, Roberta Avero wanted free of a marriage, drowning in alcohol, and Donashia Kastner just wanted to raise her son in peace. Their lives never crossed. The only thing they shared was knowing a man named Eugene Barrett, and on the streets of Honolulu, Hawaii, that man eventually killed them. From the shooting in 1959 to the stabbing in 1972 to the murder in 1995, this U.S. Army veteran committed 3 killings over the course of 36 years, becoming Hawaii's first confirmed serial killer. And in 2 of those murders, he should not even have been out on the streets. He should have been in prison. Eugene Barrett was born on June 30th, 1931, in Oakland, California, the older of 2 sons to Howard and Emily. He dropped out of Washington Intermediate School in Honolulu after 9th grade. Then, he joined the Army and fought in the Korean War. Later, in 1955, at 24, the Army threw him out with a dishonorably discharge for his excessive drinking. The next few years, he returned to Honolulu and scraped by as a house painter. There, through his mother, Emily, he met Annie Phillips. Annie and her husband Edward had 5 kids. Edward worked as a steamship crewman, while Annie stayed home with the children. With the marriage mostly spent apart, Annie decided to divorce Edward and take up with Barrett. She even promised to marry him and have his child. But the relationship was shaky from the start. Barrett could not hold a job, and his drinking only got worse. So in January 1959, Annie told him their relationship was over and she was going back to Edward, trying to catch things up, aiming to get the family back together. Perhaps through their time together, she had come to understand what kind of person Barrett was, that he loved her so much, he did not care about other women, was willing to marry her, and would even take in her 5 children, but she had no idea that Barrett would be driven to madness by the breakup. On March 7th, 1959, Barrett armed himself with a gun, got on a bus to Annie's apartment complex in Mayor Wright Homes, and forced his way into her apartment. Then he walked straight through the living room where 2 of her kids were watching television and headed into the bedroom where Annie was tending to her youngest child. Then he pulled out his gun and shot her multiple times. Minutes later, a neighbor who had heard the gunfire rushed over and stopped Barrett. The neighbor later told reporters that the only thing he said was, "I surrender." By the time Barrett was subdued, the apartment hallway was packed with neighbors drawn by the shots. Then, Joseph, Annie's brother, came running out of the apartment, stood in front of the restrained Barrett, looked him dead in the eyes, and said, "You're satisfied you killed my sister?" Barrett's answer, "She deserved it." Police arrived shortly after and arrested him. As they put him in the car, the only thing Barrett said to them was, "Hey, is Wahine dead or what?" Meanwhile, when the doctor finished with the scene, he determined Annie was dead from at least 3 gunshot wounds to her neck, back, and chest. The bedroom closet was scattered with clothes. She had apparently been folding laundry, tidying up, when Barrett struck with chilling precision, shooting her from behind. After his arrest, Barrett was taken in for questioning. He told the interrogators that he had been drinking all day the day before the shooting, and then, around 4:30 p.m. that day, he took a bus to Annie's apartment. He remembered walking into Annie's room with a gun, but could not remember the shooting itself. On March 9th, Barrett was formally charged with murder. During the subsequent trial, Joseph took the stand and walked the jury through what happened. After Annie told Barrett they were breaking up, she had been living under constant threat and he had made a point of staying at the apartment regularly to protect her. Another of Annie's brothers testified that weeks before the shooting, Barrett had told him, "If I can't have her, no one will." And Barrett kept repeating the same defense, that he had absolutely no memory of any of it, that all he knew was Joseph and his brother and some neighbors had beaten him up, and he can remember nothing of the crime. On June 19th, the final day of the trial, Prosecutor Frederick began his closing argument. He argued that one cannot blame voluntary drunkenness for murder. Not a single witness said he looked drunk, and when he was trying to get away, he was even threatening other people. A drunk could not have done these things. These actions belie his story of drunkenness. He said, "The girl gave him his walking papers and he killed her. That's all there is to it." In the end, Barrett was convicted of second-degree murder and given a life sentence. But Annie's murder happened before Hawaii officially became the 50th U.S. state. Under territorial law at the time, a life sentence could not be handed down for second-degree murder. So Barrett got sentenced to 15 to 50 years. Even with the reduced term, even with parole hearings coming up sooner, he was still looking at decades in prison. However, later on, Hawaii's then governor, the second governor, John Burns, commuted his minimum imprisonment term to 8 years for unknown reasons. There's no official record regarding Burns's specific motivation for the sentence reduction. One unverified speculation suggests that it was related to intense disputes within the state government at the time over the cost, capacity, and land use of a proposed new prison. Due to budget and land issues, he had to make efforts to control costs and capacity and made certain decisions, including alleviating prison pressure by shortening inmates' sentences. Barrett was one of them. Not only was his sentence reduced, but he was also granted parole and released from prison. In the early afternoon of December 27, 1972, at the Hawaii Hotel rooming house, a bloodied woman stumbled out of one of the rooms and collapsed in the courtyard. By the time police got there, she was dead. They found multiple stab wounds across her body. But before they could even identify her, Barrett called the police from a nearby bar and turned himself in. Later, the victim was identified as Roberta Avero, his ex-wife. They had been married less than 2 years. After getting out of prison, Barrett had met Roberta. They married and had a child, Robert. But the marriage was tense from day one. Barrett drank himself into oblivion every day, ignoring her and the baby. So that November, Roberta filed for a divorce. However, barely a month later, Barrett tracked her down at the Hawaii Hotel, grabbed a kitchen knife, and stabbed her repeatedly until she was dead. After his arrest, the Oahu grand jury returned an indictment against Barrett for second-degree murder. Then, Barrett, through his attorney, cut a deal with the prosecution and got the charge knocked down to manslaughter. On February 9, 1973, in court, he waived his right to trial and asked to be sentenced immediately. He was then sentenced to 10 years in prison. Later, after yet another parole release, Barrett spent the rest of the 1980s living a relatively quiet life in an apartment on Kainau Street in Honolulu. But his emotional instability never went away. He still drank all day, every day. During this period, he became fixated on his neighbor, 41-year-old Donishia Kastner, a single mother with a complicated history of drug use and sexual abuse who was doing her best to raise her 7-year-old son, Ethan. There was never any relationship between Barrett and Kastner, but Barrett privately accused her multiple times of mocking him, of dating other men while not dating him. Some of Barrett's friends later said he would sometimes call them in a state of hysteria, saying he was afraid he might hurt her. After another episode of this paranoid behavior, Barrett voluntarily asked to be admitted for psychiatric treatment at the Queens Medical Center, where he stayed until August 1995. But the long-term treatment did nothing to fix him. In the days after his release, he spent most of his time drinking beer with his brother and a friend. However, on the 11th, while he was at a local store buying medicine, he saw Kastner. He had assumed she had moved out of the neighborhood entirely, but she had merely moved into an apartment across the street, which infuriated him. Then he went back to his apartment, grabbed a stolen .22 5-caliber semi-automatic pistol, crossed the street, walked past Ethan playing in front of the building, entered Kastner's room, and fired 2 shots into her head. After the gunshot rang out at home, Ethan ran straight inside, saw Barrett leaving the room, and found his mother's body. Then he told his father and called the police. Police launched a manhunt for Barrett. The following day, Barrett entered the Columbia Inn and begged the manager to call the police for him. After his arrest, Barrett faced charges of murder, theft, and illegal possession of a firearm. But reporters quickly picked up on the fact that, in spite of 2 prior murder convictions, he had only served a total of 17 years in prison. Days later, a reporter interviewed the chief of the Hawaii Paroling Authority, Claudio Siebert. Siebert explained that when Barrett had come up for parole previously, the board's files did not disclose why earlier officials had released him early. But he made it clear that a modern appeals board would never approve such an early release. He said, "In today's climate, this simply does not happen." On August 15th, Barrett pleaded not guilty to second-degree murder and illegal possession of a firearm. The court initially set bail at $120,000. Then, Deputy Prosecutor Randy was able to successfully argue that his bail be revoked because he was a threat to the community. "He has killed 3 people already," he told the court. At the subsequent preliminary hearing, Kastner's 7-year-old son Ethan took the stand, making him one of the youngest witnesses in Hawaii's history. Ethan testified that after hearing the gunshots, he saw Barrett leaving the room, then found his mother's body. Neighbor Enrique corroborated this, telling the court he had heard 2 or 3 shots followed by the sound of a boy crying. At trial, Barrett's attorney argued that Barrett acted because he believed Kastner had treated him badly, that this pushed him too far and he killed her in a fit of anger. Barrett himself claimed the same thing, saying he wanted to kill the bitch for constantly choosing all the other guys over him. This did not succeed in swaying the jury. They found him guilty on all counts, and he was sentenced to life in prison. At the sentencing hearing, the judge said, "He must be removed from society. He should have been removed a long time ago. If the law did not conform with his belief structure, then he would choose to violate it. The only deterrent is to remove the defendant from society." The deputy prosecutor added, "It will operate as a de facto life without parole sentence, and he will never get out. It's taken us 3 deaths to get him where we want him." Barrett's 3 victims all had emotional relationships with him, or at least relationships he believed existed, following the pattern of an intimate partner killing. He became obsessively possessive over relationships that were not even real, and when these women rejected him or tried to get away from him, his ego was hurt. Then he would use violence to regain control, and that violence almost always ended in murder. Alcohol ran through all 3 crimes. In the first case, he used intoxication as his defense. The second marriage collapsed under his drinking. In the third, he had just gotten out of the hospital and was drinking again, and the alcohol brought back all his angry feelings and made him lose control. But that was never the real reason. He was aggressive and controlling even without alcohol. Drinking just let out the violence that was already inside him. On November 8, 2003, Barrett died at 72 from an undisclosed illness. 3 murders, 3 convictions. His crimes stretched across 36 years. His mother, Emily, defended him from the time of the first murder, but in the end, she could only watch her eldest son become a notorious serial killer. The son he had with Roberta was told that his father had killed his mother, so he spent his entire life hating his father. In January 1994, the police received an unusual call. The caller said, "I did it again. What's this? Number 5, number 6. I forget it, but she's there." Before the operator could ask for the caller's identity or confirm the location, the line went dead. Minutes later, the caller called back and said, "You all better catch me before I kill again." California's State Route 60. It is a freight corridor connecting the port of Los Angeles with the Inland Empire, going through Pomona, Diamond Bar, Chino, the City of Industry, and Ontario. It is also the basic stuff that keeps Southern California's economy going, full of industrial zones, warehouses, cheap motels, and 24-hour convenience stores. During the day, truck drivers and forklift drivers come and go. In the late night, the road belongs to a different crowd, women hanging around on the street corners, many of them black, around 30 years old, with no fixed address, no steady income. On November 1st, 1993, behind an industrial building in Diamond Bar, someone found the body of a woman. She was 37 years old, Betty Sue Harris, with a minor criminal record and time served in prison. When she had cancer and realized that she was dying, she told the people around her that she wanted to be a good mother in her last days, but she was murdered by strangulation. 4 days later, on November 5th, 12 miles east in Chino, someone found the body of 31-year-old Roxanne Brooks Bates on the side of a country road. Roxanne was from Montclair, worked as a sex worker in the Los Angeles area, and had been arrested multiple times for prostitution. The coroner confirmed she had been strangled with a cord or cloth. On the 14th, in the City of Industry. In a parking lot at an industrial park, someone found the woman lying face down, her hands tied behind her back, duct tape over her mouth, 2 pieces of fabric wrapped around her neck. The victim was later identified as 36-year-old Helen Ruth Hill, who was on probation for a drug violation. Her roommate later told police that Helen was working several jobs at once and caring for her elderly mother. 2 days later, on the 16th, in Pomona, in a corner of an industrial area, someone found the body of 35-year-old Donna Goldsmith. Police found a piece of rope, shoelaces, and a sheet of black fabric in a dumpster next to the body, things later confirmed as the murder weapons. Donna had been a medical technician with a steady income, married, with 3 children. But later she got hooked on drugs and ruined her own life. Before she was killed, she had been arrested earlier that day for shoplifting at a store just a few blocks from where her body was dumped. 4 women dead in 16 days, all dumped near Route 60. But the Pomona Police, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, and law enforcement agencies in every area along the Route 60 did not connect the cases. Because of jurisdictional boundaries, murder information could not be shared, so in the early stages, each victim was treated as a separate case. On December 30th at Gymnasia Park in Pomona, someone found 34-year-old Cheryl Sayers dead, her neck, wrists, and ankles bound, cause of death strangulation. By then, the Pomona police realized something was wrong. In less than a month, they had found 2 women killed in the same way, so they reached out to neighboring police departments on their own, and discovered that the first victim had turned up in Diamond Bar on November 1st, followed by Chino, the City of Industry, and then Pomona. The backgrounds of these victims showed a clear pattern. All black women in their 30s, most with records of prostitution, drug violations, or minor offenses. They were all killed on the streets late at night. The killer's method was the same every time: strangulation. Some victims had their hands, feet, and mouths tied up. This kind of killing takes time, sustained force, and being up close. It means the killer was brutally cold, taking pleasure in having complete control over another person's life. So police across different areas began working together. They acknowledged there was a serial killer operating along Route 60, but they had no suspects. The 6th murder came on January 12, 1994, in San Antonio Park in Ontario. The victim was 33-year-old Deborah Denise Brown, a blue cloth wrapped around her neck, strangled to death. 10 weeks, 6 victims, then the murders stopped suddenly. Who was the killer? What was his motive? At the time, investigators had almost no leads and no answers at all. All they had were 6 victims, a similar way of killing, and a map of dump sites stretching along Route 60. The joint investigation continued for a while, but with no results, these cases eventually went cold. Almost 10 years later, by March 2003, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department Cold Case Unit reopened the investigation. They entered biological evidence from Betty's case into California's DNA database, and it matched a prisoner named Evan Jerome Hill. Hill was serving a 10-year sentence in state prison for armed robbery. Then, investigators pulled his file and found he had been locked up in early 1994. The timing lined up perfectly. The murders stopped exactly when he went in. And the DNA matched the biological evidence from the cases. These information shows that the man arrested for other crimes is the serial killer they have been looking for years. Usually, when investigators catch a serial killer, they dig up unsolved cases and try to link them, hoping to clear more victims. Hill was connected to 2 unsolved murders in the San Gabriel Valley. On February 11, 1986, 35-year-old Lorna Patricia Reed, a sex worker, was strangled to death. On January 26, 1987, someone found the naked body of Rhonda Jackson, also strangled. 8 murders spanning 8 years, from 1986 to 1994. Hill's original release date was February 2004, but before he could walk free, his crimes finally caught up with him. On October 23, 2006, Hill's trial opened at the Los Angeles County Superior Court, facing 6 counts of first-degree murder. On the first day, The prosecution showed crime scene photos of the victims on a large screen in the courtroom and played the recording of Hill's taunting call, "You all better catch me before I kill again." However, not long after he said those words, he was arrested for armed robbery. On November 17th, after about 15 minutes of discussion, the jury found Hill guilty on all 6 counts of first-degree murder. During the sentencing phase, Hill's attorney Jennifer Friedman said, "I acknowledge the gravity of these crimes. I acknowledge the number of these crimes." Then, facing the victims' families and the judge, Jennifer and Hill's mother, hoping for leniency, piecing together Hill's childhood. On March 30th, 1961, Hill was born in Los Angeles. He was the oldest child, with several younger brothers and sisters. Hill's father was unemployed and constantly beat his wife and children. On December 25, 1968, Hill's father pointed a .22 caliber rifle at his mother's face and pulled the trigger. The bullet went through her face and came out the other side, and 7-year-old Hill saw the whole thing. Although her injuries were severe, Hill's mother survived. She spent months in a hospital bed, but she was left with permanent facial damage and lasting psychological trauma. There was no income, no adult able to take care of these children. So, from the age of 10, Hill became the one responsible for holding the family together. Later, Hill enrolled at Pomona High School. During those years, people who knew him formed a remarkably consistent impression. He was a good kid. Teachers found him quiet. Classmates found him reliable. No one saw anything dangerous in him. Hill's mother did not defend her son's crimes. She did not say what he did was forgivable. She simply asked for life in prison instead of death. Then, the prosecutor said, "We may not ever understand why he did what he did, but we do know the result of what he did." The judge acknowledged the abuse, but said it wasn't enough to reduce the sentence, not enough to save Hill's life. And what Hill's mother did not mention was that in 1978, the year before he graduated high school, Hill got into drugs and was quickly hooked. To pay for drugs, he started with petty theft, and after a few times, he moved up to armed robbery. On January 23, 1979, 17-year-old Hill and his 18-year-old accomplice, Benson Myers, walked into a liquor store in Glendora with guns. During the robbery, Myers shot and killed Thomas Leavell and seriously injured Keith Hunt. Both were arrested shortly after. Myers got life without parole. Hill was handled separately as a juvenile and received a short sentence. Released in the mid-1980s, he moved to the San Gabriel Valley, picking up odd jobs, warehouse work, temporary loading and unloading. In the late 1980s, he was back in prison for theft. After that, it was his cycle of crime. Released from prison, worked odd jobs, committed crimes again, and got arrested. The murders of Lorna and Rhonda happened during this period. In February 1993, Hill was released again, returned to Pomona, and took a job as a forklift operator. Then, months later, he launched his killing spree, stalking and murdering those victims, even calling the police to taunt them. On January 2, 2007, the jury recommended the death penalty for Hill. On March 21st, the judge formally sentenced him to death by lethal injection. Before the sentence was read, the judge allowed the victims' families to speak. Donna's kid Tony said, "I can never forgive you and I will never forget." Tony's daughter Precious said, "I hate you. I hope you rot in hell. You look as if there's no hurt in you." When asked by the judge if he had anything to say, Hill replied, "No, Your Honor," and was sent to death row at San Quentin State Prison. Although the sentence was handed down, Hill's execution never actually happened. California's death penalty had effectively stopped after 2006. Inmates on death row waited year after year, most of them eventually dying of natural causes rather than being executed. Hill was no exception. After more than a decade on death row, his health got worse. He was transferred to the California Healthcare Facility in Stockton. May 15, 2009, Hill confessed to the murders of Lorna and Rhonda, bringing his confirmed victim count to 8. This man, known as the 60 Freeway Killer, never publicly said another word after being identified, no apology, no explanation, no letters to the victims' families. The only complete statement he ever left this world was that You all better catch me before I kill again. From the 1970s to the 1980s, the so-called golden age of serial killers, in Anchorage, Alaska, people know that Robert Hansen took women to the wilderness and shot them like caribou. But in Fairbanks, 360 miles away, another serial killer almost disappeared from the history of crime. He was a technical sergeant in the U.S. Air Force, brazen enough to choose his hunting grounds right near the base where he lived and worked. In less than 2 years, he killed at least 5 young women and girls, the youngest one just 11 years old. His name was Thomas Bunday. He never stood trial. In March 1983, after partially confessing to investigators, he rode his motorcycle head-on into a truck and ended his own life. However, many details, including whether he had more victims, remains an unsolved mystery. On September 28, 1948, Thomas was born in Nashville, Tennessee, the younger of 2 children, and his father was a World War II veteran. In those years, countless veterans returned home carrying untreated trauma, and his father was one of them. From childhood on, Thomas had a terrible relationship with his father. The man suffered from mental disorders and often beat both his wife and Thomas. That childhood trauma left Thomas with wounds that would never heal. Later, in 1963, when his father died, 15-year-old Thomas refused to attend his funeral and ran away from home for several days. No one knew where he went, but the reason was probably simple enough. He had no interest in pretending to grieve for a man who had terrified him throughout his childhood. In 1966, after graduation, he married his high school girlfriend. 1 year into the marriage, he joined the U.S. Air Force and was serving in Southeast Asia. At that time, Thomas, like a lot of young men, thought he would finish his service, go home, and build a normal life with the woman he loved. But while he was serving in Southeast Asia, unable to be with his wife, she gave birth to a son, not his, fathered by another man. When he heard the news, Thomas did not file for divorce. He stayed, trying to patch together a marriage that was almost falling apart, and he even raised the child as his own. Later, his wife had a daughter with him, but once trust was broken, there was no fixing it. In the mid-70s, Thomas was transferred to Alston Air Force Base near Fairbanks, Alaska, where the winters are long and dark. Having been beaten by his father as a child and betrayed by his wife as an adult, Thomas had long since lost any ability to cope with pain in healthy ways. Over the next few years, his mental state deteriorated. The signs of emotional exhaustion became harder and harder to ignore, and he even started seeing a psychiatrist. But by then, it was already too late. On August 29, 1979, a 19-year-old Fairbanks resident named Glinda Sodman disappeared. 2 months later, a boy hunting in the woods near Moose Creek, close to Alston Air Force Base, found a woman's body. Aside from a single .38 caliber shell casing, nothing else was found at the scene. The autopsy confirmed it was Sodman. She had not been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled and then shot in the back of the head. While police were still working the Sodman case, a second disappearance came on June 13, 1980. 11-year-old Doris Aring from North Pole, Alaska, had vanished. But unlike the Sodman investigation, which had gone nowhere, this one gave them something. Not long after Doris vanished, police found her bicycle in a ditch. More importantly, her brother said that in the days before she disappeared, he had seen her talking to a stranger who was wearing an Air Force uniform and sitting in a blue car. 6 months later, when police still did not know whether Doris was alive or dead, 2 more women vanished from the Fairbanks area. On January 31, 1981, 21-year-old Marlene Peters disappeared while hitchhiking from Fairbanks to Anchorage. 5 weeks after that, 16-year-old Wendy Wilson had also vanished. As the number of victims grew, the Alaska State Troopers, the Fairbanks Police Department, the North Pole Police Department, and the FBI formed a joint task force to investigate. 3 days after Wendy went missing, her body was found. Marlene's badly decomposed remains turned up not far from Wendy's. Like the others, both women had been strangled and shot, with no sign of sexual assault. At that time, investigators were completely stuck. These crimes followed no pattern, and the remains just kept coming. About a month later, the fifth victim turned up, 18-year-old Lori King. This time, investigators committed every available resource, launching a joint military and civilian search effort that continued for weeks. Their efforts yielded nothing. Then, in October 1981, several servicemen hunting in the woods near Alston Air Force Base discovered Lori's rotting body. The autopsy showed the same thing: strangled, then shot, with no sign of sexual assault. At this point, investigators finally began to suspect the killer might be in the military. Every body that had been found was dumped along remote roads, gravel pits, and wooded areas near Alston. Only someone familiar with those areas would use them as disposal sites. So they went back through the files and checked every person assigned to Alston, including the employees employed as civilian specialists. By February 1982, 3 names had been added to the suspect list. One of them was Thomas. He owned a blue car and a white pickup, matching the witness description perfectly. He also had a record of multiple misconduct incidents on base, and several female coworkers had filed complaints about inappropriate sexual comments and harassment. But without direct evidence, and since Thomas had been transferred to Shepherd Air Force Base in September 1981, so the investigation was forced into a standstill. Almost a year later, in November 1982, Alaska investigators got a call from Henrietta, Texas. A woman named Cassandra Goodwin had been found dead there, killed in the same manner as the 5 victims in Alaska. The case broke the stalemate. After Thomas left Alaska for Texas, no more murders occurred in Alaska. Then an identical murder surfaced at his new posting. A few months later, after interstate coordination, investigators arrived in Texas in March 1983. On March 3rd, Thomas was brought in for questioning. Investigators interrogated him about the 5 Alaska murders and the one in Texas. Each session lasted several hours. At first, Thomas refused to answer directly. He stonewalled them for nearly a week. On the 3rd day, he even handed them a note. "I really like you guys and have enjoyed talking with you, but I did not do these things." Several days later, investigators got a search warrant. After searching his house and the trunk of his car, they found physical evidence that directly tied him to the 5 murders. Shell casings linked to the cases, newspaper clippings about the murders, and Wendy's hair. Once he learned the evidence had been found, Thomas's attitude shifted. He began confessing, admitted he had killed those girls in Alaska, describing the murders in detail. When asked why he had systematically strangled and shot young women he did not even know, he cited psychological problems and sexual complexes as motives for committing the murders. The abuse he suffered as a child had left Thomas consumed by enormous rage and helplessness for years, and the betrayal and humiliation in his marriage had further destroyed his dignity as a man, leaving him unable to control his aggressive impulses. In the end, he targeted young women, killing them by strangulation and shooting. But when asked about Cassandra's murder, he flatly denied it. Even though Thomas had confessed, jurisdiction issues meant the Alaska investigators had no authority to arrest him in Texas. They could only keep him under surveillance until the warrant was issued, to prevent him from fleeing or going into hiding. On March 15, 1983, Alaska authorities issued a warrant for Thomas's arrest. But he managed to slip away from surveillance. Then he got on his motorcycle, rode onto the highway, and, about 40 miles outside Wichita Falls, swerved into oncoming traffic at 100 miles an hour, crashing head-on into a truck and killing himself instantly. He refused to be arrested, refused to stand in court and face trial, was unwilling to face justice for the things that he had done. He decided to end everything on his own way. The whereabouts of Doris's body and whether there were more victims became mysteries that died with him. It was not until August 1986 that Doris's remains were found. Like the other victims, she had a bullet hole in her skull. The location was that same remote woodland near Alston Air Force Base. Later, investigators realized it was no accident that Thomas had dumped the remains near the base. His job gave him access to security cameras overlooking those areas, letting him revisit his crimes over and over. And the reason he refused to admit killing Cassandra was most likely to avoid the death penalty. Alaska did not have capital punishment. Even if he had been sentenced to death there, it would not have been carried out. But, in the end, his death rendered all of it moot. On February 24, 1986, the manager of an apartment building in Talladega, Alabama, used a spare key to open the door of one tenant's apartment. Shortly before, someone from the local Institute for the Deaf and Blind had contacted him, saying that their student, 24-year-old Sherry Weathers, had been missing from classes for 5 full days with no word. So they asked him to help check on her safety. Weathers was a hearing-impaired single mother with 2 young children, 4-year-old Joey and 5-year-old Chad. When the manager went into Weathers' apartment, he found something was wrong. Even though Weathers and her 2 children were lying in bed, covered by a blanket, a bad smell was coming from there. The manager quickly called the police to report the situation and request that officers come to investigate. Before long, the officers arrived at the scene and confirmed that Weathers and her 2 children were dead. The cause of death for all 3 was asphyxiation, and Weathers' room was the crime scene. Then, the manager shared that Weathers' neighbor, 33-year-old Linda Jarman, she was also a student at the Institute for the Deaf and Blind and had a hearing impairment, had also lost contact. Given that Weathers had already been murdered, he suspected that Jarman might have also been murdered. Minutes later, the manager led the officers to open Jarman's apartment door. No one was in the living room, and her television was still on. Jarman's naked body was found on her bed, and her car had disappeared. Around the same time, the police dispatcher received a report that 32-year-old cocktail waitress Linda Odom had been reported missing. Before this, she had been involved with a man who called himself Danny Ray Spence. Since there were no signs of forced entry in any of the victims' rooms, investigators immediately focused their suspicion on people known to the victims. Soon their investigation pointed to Spence, the man who had been involved with Linda. As the investigation went deeper, they discovered that Spence had not only been in contact with Linda, but had also dated Weathers. Months earlier, after arriving in Talladega, Spence had volunteered as an art teacher at the Institute for the Deaf and Blind. There he met Weathers, and through her, he met Jarman. But no one found where Spence was, because on the day after the victims' deaths, February 20th, when no one knew what had happened, he had mysteriously disappeared. Days later, fingerprints collected from the 2 crime scenes gave comparison results. The results pointed to a wanted man named Daniel Lee Siebert. In 1979, Daniel had been convicted of manslaughter in Las Vegas, Nevada. After his release from prison, he was charged with first-degree assault for attacking a woman in San Francisco in 1985. By this point, investigators had confirmed that Spence was a fake name. The man who had volunteered to teach deaf and blind students to paint was actually a fugitive with a prior homicide conviction who was actively wanted. Although Daniel's whereabouts had not yet been found, as time passed, the evidence slowly came out. On March 3rd, Jarman's stolen car was found on Interstate 65 near Elizabethtown, Kentucky. The car's tires had blown out, which was the reason it had been left behind. Investigators found Daniel's fingerprints in the car, as well as an apartment key. At a nearby campsite, they also found a large amount of women's underwear and a birth certificate with the name Daniel Ray Spence. On March 30th, Linda's naked, decomposed remains were found on the outskirts of Talladega. The cause of her death was also asphyxiation. The operation to hunt down Daniel lasted about 6 months. In those days, he moved through the highway system like a ghost on the road, constantly changing locations, using fake names, and not forming long-term connections with anyone. But the real breakthrough in the case actually came from Daniel himself. On September 3rd, one of Daniel's friends contacted the police, stating that Daniel had called her. The police immediately prepared to wait for Daniel's next call. Hours later, his call came. Then, while he was chatting with his friends, the police traced his location to a phone box in Tennessee. In those days, GPS positioning technology was not yet fully developed. The police could not obtain his exact location, but one thing helped them. At that moment, the sound of rain could be heard in the background of Daniel's call, which meant it was raining where he was. The police confirmed that it was raining in Nashville, not in Memphis, thus confirming that the call was made from a phone box near the Nashville West Interstate. After pinpointing Daniel's location, Local police showed his photos to employees at restaurants near the place. Then, a restaurant employee recognized Daniel and stated that this man was working there doing sign painting. 6 months of pursuit, they had finally found Daniel's exact whereabouts. The next day, September 4th, the police arrested Daniel when he came to work. In the interrogation room, when asked about his crimes, he confessed to the 5 murders in Alabama, Weathers and her 2 children, as well as Jarman and Linda. Later, while awaiting trial, Daniel revealed information about several other victims. In 1985, he strangled 28-year-old Gidget Castro and 23-year-old Nesia McElrath in Los Angeles. Both women were black, both were strangled, and both were robbed. He also confessed to strangling 57-year-old Beatrice McDougal in Atlantic City, New Jersey. In 1986, her body was found in a hotel room. In addition, investigators suspected that he had committed more cases. For example, the body of 19-year-old Cheryl Evans was found in Calhoun County the day after 5 murders in Alabama. Daniel himself also implied that he had killed more people. But because there was not enough evidence, these suspicions were never confirmed. After his arrest, Daniel was quite cooperative, and his attitude even left an impression on investigators. Former District Attorney Robert Rumsey said, "He seemed like a pretty decent person." Daniel's defense attorney, George Sims, said the same thing. He was a very pleasant man to talk to. When asked why Daniel became a serial killer, George said, "He had a tough childhood without question, I think maybe abused by his father." Information about Daniel's early life only appears in trial records and his prison interviews. On June 17, 1954, he was born into a troubled family in Mattoon, Illinois. His father was an alcoholic who often put his 2 children, Daniel and a daughter, through physical and sexual abuse, beatings, rape, and forcing Daniel to wear girls' underwear while having sexual relations with him. In fact, government agencies and the police could have stopped these things, but Daniel's mother was afraid of her husband, unable to stop him, and dared not expose the abuse happening in the home. Later, in 1965, his mother finally took 11-year-old Daniel and his sister and left home. But years of abuse had already caused problems for Daniel's mental state. At the age of 12, he chose to run away from home, was lost to the streets and drugs and prostitution. When he was 18 years old, he joined the Marines under the fake name Daniel Marlowe. He hoped that the structured environment would change his life. However, he was given a dishonorable discharge. Between 1973 and 1975, Daniel fathered a son and a daughter. Later, he spoke with his son about his mother taking them away from his father. He said, "It was too late." In fact, in this world, some people have also experienced those terrible things, and they did not choose to commit crimes. George also said he had it tough, but other people do too and do not do things like that. In 1979, Daniel killed a woman in Las Vegas. She was his girlfriend, and he stabbed her 29 times. This was his first known murder, and the method was different from the strangulation he later used regularly. For this case, he was convicted of manslaughter and sent to prison. After his release, he began his wandering life, hitchhiking, using different names, moving between different states. In 1985, he attacked a woman in San Francisco. Because of this assault, he was wanted by the San Francisco police. Then, Daniel stood trial in Alabama. For Jarman's murder, he was convicted of first-degree murder. For the murders of Weathers and her children, the jury found him guilty on June 17, 1987, and recommended the death penalty. For Linda's murder, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. And those cases in Los Angeles, New Jersey, and other locations, prosecutors did not pursue charges after the death sentence in Alabama. Daniel's execution date was set for October 25, 2007. After entering death row, he continued to paint, something he had learned in childhood to escape his father's abuse. But the subjects of his paintings were completely different from when he was a child hiding from his father. He painted scenes involving women in bondage and sold those works through a website. When the time came, several hours before the execution, the federal court issued a stay order. The reason for the stay order was not related to the conviction, but rather concerned his physical condition. In those days, Daniel was suffering from pancreatic cancer, which was in its final stage. Daniel's attorney argued that the drugs used for lethal injection might interact with the cancer medications he was taking and causing severe pain, which would be cruel and unusual punishment prohibited by the Eighth Amendment to the United States Constitution. Meanwhile, Alabama Governor Bob Riley responded to calls for clemency with a firm refusal. In his statement, he said, "I would in essence be commuting his sentence to life in prison, and that is not the sentence he was given by the jury. His crimes were monstrous, brutal, and ghastly." However, in the end, Daniel's execution was still not carried out, because on April 22, 2008, he died in Holman Prison in Alabama. The cause was complications from cancer. Later, Alabama Attorney General Troy King issued a statement upon learning of Daniel's death. Talking about Daniel's wish to die of cancer before his execution, he said, "It's a shame that he got what he wanted, but the people who he brutally executed had no say in the matter at all, and that is the injustice of this." In the late summer of 1977, in Reno, Nevada, a local ambulance service had just hired a dispatch assistant named Charles William Davis Jr. from Maryland. His resume read, "Volunteer Assistant Chief of Staff, Laboratory Technician, Electrician, and Security Guard." But nobody knew that before that, from 1974 to early 1977, he had already approached and murdered at least 4 women, all under the guise of offering help. But 2 weeks before he got that job, on July 20th, 1977, 2 police officers pulled over his Volkswagen Beetle for a stolen license plate. David Horan and Gary Hartman, on routine patrol, had noticed something off about the plate, so they did what they always did and stopped the car. The owner, Davis, admitted the plate was stolen, but refused to say why. After Davis allowed them to inspect the interior of his car, Hartman found a CB radio under the seat. They confirmed the radio had been stolen and arrested Davis for theft, transported him to the county jail. In the county jail, Davis insisted he was innocent and showed investigators a receipt from a Baltimore store, claiming he had bought the radio legally. So the theft charge was dropped, and Davis walked free. However, further investigation turned things around. The radio was actually purchased with a stolen credit card, and the cardholder was Carroll Willingham, who had been sexually assaulted and robbed in Baltimore months earlier. Police immediately arranged for Willingham to see if Davis was her attacker. Then the moment she saw his photo, she recognized him as the man who had assaulted her. Shortly afterwards, authorities issued an arrest warrant, but by the time police got to Davis's house, he had already left Baltimore and vanished without a trace. On August 31st, an informant told police about Davis's whereabouts. He and his fiancée had fled to Reno, where he was working as a dispatch assistant at a local ambulance service. The next day, September 1st, with the help of Reno police, Davis was arrested. 3 days later, he was extradited back to Baltimore. But during the return trip, at a brief stop in Jessup, Davis suddenly told the officers escorting him that he wanted to confess something about the death of 23-year-old Peggy Pumpian. In the interrogation room, facing recording equipment, Davis not only confessed to Peggy's murder, but also voluntarily described what happened to 24-year-old Kathleen Cook. The police had thought they were just chasing down a stolen radio and an assault case. Instead, they got pulled into 2 murders. On New Year's Eve 1975, Davis was at a nightclub looking for a female social worker. Months earlier, he had lost a custody battle and been stripped of his son's guardianship. Davis had decided the social worker was the reason he lost it, so he wanted revenge. Kathleen was at that same nightclub celebrating the new year with her husband, and she happened to bear a slight resemblance to the social worker. Then Davis lured her to the parking lot with the excuse that her car was blocking his, and drove her away. Along the way, Davis realized he had grabbed the wrong person, a complete stranger with no connection to him whatsoever. After hearing Davis's explanation, Kathleen straight up demanded he let her go. She warned him she was engaged to a high-ranking Baltimore police officer and he would pay dearly for this. But Davis didn't let her go. He pulled over at a vacant lot near a shopping center in Catonsville and raped her. During the time, Kathleen never stopped fighting back. She kept threatening and humiliating Davis, mocking him as impotent and unpopular with women. In the end, those words enraged him. He pulled out a .38 caliber revolver and shot her 4 times, then stabbed her repeatedly until she stopped struggling. On August 24, 1976, Peggy was driving on Interstate 95 and got lost. She wanted to ask for directions to the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, and along the way she pulled over and asked Davis for directions. After a brief conversation, Davis got into Peggy's car, saying he knew a shortcut. But the moment he got in, he pulled out a revolver and robbed her. Peggy figured Davis would just take the money and leave, but Davis wanted more. He sexually assaulted her at gunpoint, and in the end, he fired 5 times in the chest, killing her. Then he wiped his fingerprints from Peggy's car and drove to New York to establish a credible alibi. 8 hours later, Peggy's body was found. When police recovered the bullets and ran ballistics tests, the barrel rifling marks matched the weapon used in Kathleen's case perfectly. Police confirmed both cases were committed by the same person, but it wasn't until Davis confessed that they knew he was the killer. On February 23, 1977, Willingham ran into Davis on the street. Just like with Peggy, Davis tricked her into his car under the pretense of helping her, drove her to a wooded area outside the city, and beat, robbed, and raped her. The day after his arrest, Davis was formally charged with 2 counts of murder. A number of high-ranking law enforcement officials organized a meeting to discuss how to prosecute him. Since all the murders had occurred in the Baltimore area, the prosecutor's office was worried that intense news coverage would compromise jury impartiality, so they decided to move him elsewhere and try him separately. Davis was first sent to Allegheny County to stand trial for Kathleen's murder. In early 1978, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder and illegal possession of a firearm. On April 12th, he was sentenced to life in prison. Then the prosecution charged him again with Peggy's murder, and in April 1979, he received a second life sentence. Later, Davis additionally confessed to another aggravated sexual assault, as well as the murder of Lydia Norman. At the end of 1974, a 23-year-old woman's car broke down outside Baltimore. Davis happened to be driving by, offered to help, and gave her a ride, but he didn't take her home. He dragged her into nearby woods, sexually assaulted her, and tried to strangle her. After the woman had apparently died, Davis assumed she was dead and left the scene alone. Sometime later, the woman regained consciousness, struggled back to town, and received treatment. After recovering, she described Davis's appearance to police, who produced a composite sketch based on her description. That was the earliest clue Davis left behind, but nobody connected him to that sketch. On September 11, 1975, 16-year-old Norman, a student at Randallstown High School, went out on a date with Davis. When Norman refused his demand to have sex, an enraged Davis sexually assaulted and strangled her to death. In early 1979, Davis was transferred to Anne Arundel County to stand trial for Norman's murder. For the 3rd time, a jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving 48 years. During the trial, he showed no expression whatsoever, remaining silent and calm throughout the entire proceeding. Later, Davis's background was uncovered. He was born on June 18, 1947, in Baltimore, Maryland. Public records about his childhood were sparse. All that was known is that his father was a local police lieutenant. As an adult, he cycled through numerous jobs, working as an electrician, security guard, laboratory technician, and volunteer assistant chief of staff at a Baltimore volunteer rescue squad. In the early 1970s, he married and had a son, but the marriage didn't last. He eventually divorced and lost the custody battle and was stripped of his child's guardianship. This thing hit him hard, and it led him to harbor a grudge against the female social worker and to kill Kathleen. From this point onward, the level of violence in his crimes visibly escalated. Because he had a police lieutenant for a father and had spent time in a volunteer rescue squad, Davis knew the Baltimore area's emergency systems and police operations inside and out. He used that knowledge to get close to victims and cover his tracks, which was exactly why police never suspected him all those years. His crimes were primarily about rape, and murder was usually driven by impulse, whenever the victim challenged his control, refused, resisted, or, like Kathleen, provoked him. Beyond that, he had a signature element when he struck. After killing a victim, he would actively call police and provide clues about the body's location, as if he were observing their reactions and drawing some kind of satisfaction from it. After his conviction, Davis served his sentence in Maryland's prison system and was transferred between multiple facilities over the years. Just when everyone assumed he had confessed to all his crimes in 2024, Howard County cold case investigators tracked him down again. They wanted to ask about an unsolved case from August 24, 1975. 20-year-old Rosen Sturtz walked into a bar that day and never came home. Her body wasn't found until that December in woods near Columbia. The cold case investigators found a 1981 audio tape in the files. Back then, Howard County Police had interrogated Davis about this case, and he had indeed mentioned certain details. But during that interrogation, police showed him an old photo of Rosen. Davis failed to recognize her. Because of that, the case could never be closed, remaining unsolved and shelved for nearly 50 years. This time, the cold case investigator, Corporal Wade, brought a photo taken 1 month before Roseanne's death. When Davis saw it, he nodded and admitted that Rosen was one of his victims, and he described how that night he got into an argument with Rosen at the bar, then managed to lure her to a secluded area, sexually assaulted her, and killed her. Even though the state prosecutor had granted Davis full immunity back in 1981, meaning he couldn't be additionally prosecuted for this case, the case could finally be officially closed. Later, Roseanne's family issued a statement after learning the truth. "We were grateful to have all the case details, learned Roseanne's actual date of death, and received the closure we have been praying for all these years, finally put to rest the answers we never had." Davis, used to crave media attention, wanted his crimes remembered by the world, made anonymous calls to authorities directing them to where he had left remains. But in a way, the women he hurt deserve to be remembered far more than he does. Rosen Sturtz, Lydia Norman, Kathleen Cook, Peggy Pumpian, and the women who escaped with their lives. On March 20, 2000, the Irving Police Department received a call. The caller was a man named Jason Shields, who works at the local car wash. He told the operator that he had seen several of his colleagues lying in pools of blood, and that his former colleague, Robert Wayne Harris, was standing near the cash register. While Jason was still on the phone with the operator, Harris also arrived at the shop. He took the phone and told the operator that he was just a witness, that he had stumbled upon the crime scene by chance. Following a brief exchange, he left the shop. The Irving Police Department then sent multiple squad cars to both the car wash and the donut shop to find Jason. When the police arrived at the car wash, they found 3 victims lying face down in the lobby, all shot in the back of the head at close range. They were employees who worked at the car wash: 32-year-old Benjamin, 15-year-old Roberto, and Ramos. The office was even more horrifying. Inside, 48-year-old manager Dennis, 36-year-old assistant manager Augustin, and 46-year-old cashier Wheeler were on the floor. All 3 shot in the back of the head at close range. Dennis's throat was also slit. The office safe was open, and the cash inside had been completely cleaned out. Later, after an examination, it was found that of the 6 people, only Ramos had survived, but he was left with permanent disabilities. Prosecutor Greg Davis later recalled seeing the crime scene photos. He said, "I remember the floors just covered with blood. I remember just the vicious nature of the offense, and that fact was conceived by Robert Harris." Not long after, several officers found Jason and took him back to the station for questioning. In the interrogation room, Jason described everything he had been through. When he walked into the car wash, he saw Benjamin, Roberto, and Ramos all lying face down in the lobby, and Harris was standing right there by the cash register. Harris explained to him that he had also just discovered these things, but as he spoke, he pulled a knife from the bookshelf. This made Jason uneasy, so he said he needed to step outside for some fresh air, then ran to the donut shop, with Harris following right behind him. After finishing his account, Jason also provided the police with a crucial piece of information. Just a few days before the killings, Harris had been fired for masturbating in front of a female customer. Then the police quickly identified 2 of Harris's friends, one who had lent him a car and another who had lent him a pistol. Several officers then went to the first friend's home for questioning. He told them that Harris had borrowed the car the day before the killings, and shortly after the killings, Harris returned the vehicle and told him he had found the victims dead at the car wash. Meanwhile, other officers found Harris's other friend, Billy Brooks. Billy admitted that the day before the killings, Harris had come to his house, and he then got his stepson to lend Harris a pistol. Later on the day of the killings, Harris took a taxi to his place, where Harris disposed of the knife, crowbar, and pieces of a phone. Harris also pulled out a large sum of cash, roughly $4,000. He bought some new clothes, checked into a motel, and had Billy go out and buy him a gold cross necklace. These details gave the police everything they needed to confirm that Harris was the killer. Clearly, this was not a simple robbery murder, but a carefully planned revenge killing by Harris. He borrowed a car and a pistol from friends in advance, one for running away, one for killing. He knew how the car wash worked. He knew the money truck came every day, except Sunday, so he chose Monday. During the crime, he showed extreme coldness. He made the victims open the safe, then shot them in the back of the head at close range, and cut the throat of Dennis, the man who fired him. When Jason found the scene, he tried to chase and kill him, but when that failed, he immediately ran away. Later, he returned the borrowed car and got rid of some of the tools he used. The next morning, March 21st, police arrested Harris at another friend's home. When officers knocked and entered, Harris was inside. He didn't resist. He accepted the arrest. In the interrogation room, faced with the evidence the police had gathered, Harris admitted to killing 6 of his former coworkers. Just when the police thought the interrogation was winding down, however, Harris brought up another murder case on his own. In November 1999, he had killed a woman named Sandra Scott. Sandra, 37 years old, had been missing for 4 months, and Harris had initially been questioned about her disappearance. Harris said he killed her because he suspected she had stolen $200 from his wallet. He described in detail how he had killed her, and then led police to her remains in an overgrown ditch littered with garbage. But the prosecution ultimately did not try him for this case. The evidence from the car wash shooting was already more than enough to send him to death row, and the evidence in the Sandra case was comparatively weak, so a separate trial did not make much sense. In September 2000, Harris was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for Alston and Wheeler. The prosecution announced before the trial even began that, if convicted, they would seek the death penalty. The trial started on September 25th. In his closing argument during the guilt phase, prosecutor Greg Davis stated that Harris acted out of hatred, revenge, nothing more. "You can only imagine what was going through the minds of the people who were shot," he said. "God only knows." Then, after roughly 15 minutes of deliberation, the jury found Harris guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. At the sentencing hearing, Harris's attorney requested a life sentence and shifted the focus of the case to Harris's mental state and early life. As Harris's defense attorney, Brad Lawler, later admitted, "There wasn't much question about the guilt. No question. He was guilty. Our whole aim was to get him a life sentence." They pieced together Harris's childhood. Harris was born on February 28, 1972, in Dallas County, Texas. When he was 8 years old, he watched his father kill his mother and then kill himself. Later, Harris bounced between various relatives' homes. As he grew older, he was bullied by classmates at school and placed in special education classes because of a stutter. These experiences left his mental state in shambles, and he was diagnosed with aggressive conduct disorder. Lawler later said that would affect the mind of anybody. When he was 15, Harris assaulted a mall clerk and burglarized his aunt's home and struck her in the head with a hammer. For that incident, he spent 2 years in a juvenile correctional facility. When he was 17 years old, he started dealing drugs, and 2 years later, he was sentenced to 8 years in prison for 3 counts of burglary. While in prison, he spent most of his time in administrative segregation, the highest level of solitary confinement reserved for problematic inmates. He set fire to his cell, assaulted and threatened to kill correctional officers and other prisoners, and was involved in drug dealing, insubordination, and sexual misconduct. Psychologists diagnosed Harris with depression, antisocial personality disorder, and Tourette syndrome. Early violent behavior, persistent rule violations, and no response to punishment. These behaviors fully matched his diagnosed antisocial personality disorder. Davis did not deny Harris's childhood experiences, but he pointed out that Harris knew right from wrong and had good role models for most of his life. The prosecution also presented evidence showing that Harris had actually prepared to leave for Florida on the very day he was arrested. He had packed his bags and gathered supplies for a long trip. His plan was to find one of his ex-girlfriends and kill her. Police later confirmed that this ex-girlfriend had been in a brief, violent relationship with Harris. She had moved to Florida while he was in prison, completely unaware that he had been released and had no idea that she was his next target. On September 29th, after 2 hours of deliberation, the jury recommended the death penalty. Then, the judge sentenced Harris to death by lethal injection. 2 of victim Wheeler's children, Charity and Jeremy, were in the courtroom during the sentencing. They expressed a positive view of the sentence. Charity said, "If it had to happen, I'm glad it happened in Texas because they will get rid of him faster in Texas than they would in any other state." Over the following 12 years, Harris went through a series of appeals while on death row. His appellate attorney, Lydia Brandt, raised 2 main points. First, that Harris was mentally slow and therefore should not be put to death under the Supreme Court's rule. Second, that the prosecutor had wrongly kept black potential jurors off the jury, which was racial discrimination. State attorneys opposed the appeals, saying IQ tests disputed the mental impairment claims and that no racial component was involved in jury selection. On September 20th, 2012, the day of his execution, Harris was put to death at the Huntsville unit. He turned down a last interview request from reporters. In the late afternoon, he was led into the death chamber. His brother and 3 friends watched from behind a glass wall. Family and friends of the 6 victims watched from another room, but Harris did not once look at them. At 6:43 p.m., Harris was pronounced dead. His final words were, "I want to tell you all, know that I love you. Billy, I love you. English, Hart, and Eloise. I'm going home. I'm going home." He was the 8th prisoner executed in Texas in 2012. His appellate attorney Lydia said after his death, Harris died without ever having had a fair trial on the issues. Davis recalled the case and said, "I remember the floors just covered with blood. I remember just the vicious nature of the offense, and that fact was conceived by Robert Harris." And the surviving victim, Ramos, never spoke publicly about what happened that day. Harris never showed any remorse. In the death chamber, he did not look at the victims' families, not even once. He spoke the names of his loved ones and friends in his final words, but none of those names were among the people he had killed. In late September 2004, in an interrogation room at the Mobile County Sheriff's Department in Alabama, sat a man arrested for murdering his neighbor. His name was Jeremy Bryan Jones. In the media, they called him a low-rent Ted Bundy because he had a face that put people at ease, a face skilled at masking itself behind politeness and casual charm. To those around him, Jones was a good young man, a good partner. However, in his own telling, he was a serial killer who had spent 12 years crossing 5 states, taking 20 lives. With the help of a polygraph, Jones spoke about Catherine Collins in New Orleans, Patrice Enders in Georgia, the Freeman family in Oklahoma, a couple shot and burned. Their 16-year-old daughter and her best friend remain missing. He described the cases in such detail that even seasoned police officers were on the verge of believing they had solved a series of unsolved murders spanning the entire southeastern United States. However, during the trial, Jones retracted every single confession. His reason was very simple. The confessions were lies, he said. He had fabricated them all just to secure better prison conditions. A phone call with his mother, a decent meal, a few hours of visitation, nothing more. At sentencing, facing public outrage, he said that God will have the final say, that one day he'll be a free man. He'll write him a book and laugh his ass off. On September 15, 2004, the day before Hurricane Yvonne was set to tear through, in a small community near Satsuma called Turnerville. Jones had taken the alias John Paul Chapman and hired himself out to a local couple, Mark and Kim Bentley, to help reinforce their home. By then, Oklahoma already had a warrant out for his arrest. Serious sex crime charges including rape, rape with a foreign object, sodomy, failure to register as a sex offender, and 3 counts of felony bail jumping. While working on the house, Jones, using the excuse that many homeless people would occupy vacant houses during the hurricane and that he needed a gun for self-defense, learned that Mark had hidden a .25 caliber handgun in his bedroom closet. On the 16th, a woman named Lisa Nichols returned to Turnerville after waiting for Hurricane Ivan to pass. She was Kim's neighbor. While she was chatting with Kim, Jones overheard her telling Kim that she was single and lived alone. The 17th, the Bentley household slowly emptied. Mark finished up some backyard repairs and drove 30 minutes to a fast food joint for burgers. Kim took the kids out, and Mark's cousin, Coleman, went to visit a friend and help fix his house. Jones was the only one left. Armed with the knowledge that Lisa lived alone, he grabbed that .25 caliber pistol and a package of Bud Light beers and walked into her house. Inside, he raped Lisa at gunpoint, then fired 3 shots into her. To cover his tracks, he went back to the Bentley house for gasoline cans, dragged her body into the bathtub, doused her with fuel, and set her on fire. When he was done, he strolled back to the Bentley's house, changed his clothes, took a shower, and waited for everyone to return as if nothing had happened. The next day, Lisa's daughter and son-in-law arrived in Turnerville. With Hurricane Ivan having passed through, they'd tried calling Lisa and got no answer, so, fearing something had happened, they came to check on her. The neighborhood's power lines were down, the house still without electricity. So Lisa's son-in-law took a flashlight and searched the house, and then finding her charred remains in the bathtub. After found the scene, Lisa's daughter ran to the Bentley house to tell them to call the police. Officers sealed off the crime scene and, following standard procedure, began questioning those present, Mark, Jones, and others. Jones refused outright, but at that stage the questioning was voluntary and under the Fifth Amendment, so he didn't owe anyone a reason for his silence. Early on the morning of September 19th, Jones slipped out of Turnerville without a word, and meanwhile, investigators found 3.25 caliber bullets lodged in the walls at the crime scene. During questioning, Mark mentioned he had a .25 pistol at home and turned it over to police. Examination showed it had been fired recently, and ballistics matched it to the murder weapon. Because they possessed the murder weapon, Mark, Kim, Coleman were brought into interrogation. There, Coleman recalled that the pistol might have been taken by Chapman. He knew where it was kept. At the same time, investigators still at the crime scene found an empty can of Bud Light with fingerprints on it. They ran the prints against those taken when Jones had been detained under the Chapman alias, and perfect match. In the early hours of September 21st, Jones was arrested, and the manhunt gradually peeled back his real identity. At first, the Mobile County Sheriff's Office found that their suspect Chapman's birth date and social security number matched a prisoner currently serving time in Missouri. Then the real Chapman, questioned by authorities, stated that his mother had sold his identity and social security card to a fugitive named Jeremy Bryan Jones. In order to confirm further, they obtained fingerprint samples from Jones's earlier arrest in Miami, Oklahoma, ran the comparison, and finally established that their suspect Chapman was Jones. Jones stonewalled and deflected every question from investigators. "I'm not saying I wasn't over at her house," he said. "I'm saying I did not kill her." But forensic testing had already confirmed the murder weapon was the Bentley's pistol, and the fingerprints on that empty beer can were his. Cornered by the evidence, Jones shifted his story, admitted responsibility for Lisa's death, and pinned it all on methamphetamine. He claimed that day he and Lisa had smoked meth together and had sex, but then Lisa suddenly complained of chest pain, then stomach pain, and shortly after, she died in the bathroom. Upon discovering her body in a drug-addled state, he fired 3 shots into her head and burned the corpse. But this version collapsed almost immediately because his next confession kept changing. The second time, he admitted breaking into Lisa's house armed with the intent to rape, but when he couldn't perform, he flew into a rage, covered her head with a towel, and shot her. By the third version, it was all just an accident. During this period, Jones made several phone calls from county jail to his mother, friends, acquaintances, and his live-in partner, Vicky Freeman. Once investigators located these people, they were questioned for more information about Jones. It turned out Jones' criminal behavior was closely linked to his severe methamphetamine addiction. He was a serial killer twisted by lies and drugs, who had exhibited antisocial and aggressive tendencies since childhood. Jones was born on April 12, 1973, in Miami, Oklahoma. By 16, he had picked up not just alcohol but a drug habit. Neighbors described him with vacant eyes, paranoid and agitated, clearly riding out a meth high. Jones himself embraced the thug mentality. He called himself a junkie and a drunk who did terrible things under the influence. In January 1990, he was arrested for assaulting a boy and the boy's mother. Police charged him with 2 counts of assault, but both were dropped after the victims reconciled with Jones. On November 5, 1995, he was charged with rape in Oklahoma and skipped bail after posting bond. Then on January 10th, he was arrested again for rape and illegal methamphetamine possession. A day later, a woman reported to police that Jones had sexually assaulted her at gunpoint. Jones first served 2 years on the drug possession charge, and after his 1997 release, he was detained on the rape charges. On his attorney's advice, Jones agreed to plead guilty, but because the female victim feared testifying, his 3 rape charges were reduced to sexual battery. In the end, he received only 5 years probation for assault and sexual battery. During probation, he was required to attend court-ordered sex offender counseling, but he performed terribly, ignored court orders, and twice refused to provide DNA samples. In 2000, due to severe probation violations plus 2 new rape allegations, the court revoked Jones's probation and issued an arrest warrant. So he began his life on the run. Later in Joplin, Missouri, he met Chapman's mother at a bar. Using his charm and smooth talk, he won her over and convinced her to sell her son's identity and social security card for $50. From then on, Jones operated under the Chapman alias, and this carefully calculated strategy worked successfully for a long time. In December 2000, Jones relocated to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where he scraped by mainly on odd jobs, evading capture while adjusting to life under the Chapman alias, essentially marking this period as the calm before his return to violence. In 2003, he moved to Georgia, and on May 1st, he met Freeman in Douglasville. In front of Freeman, he comes across as kind, gentle, and considerate, but in front of some neighbors, he constantly makes disparaging remarks and jokes about women, such as, "What do you tell a woman with 2 black eyes?" "Nothing, you already told the bitch twice." In October 2003, Jones was arrested for disorderly conduct. Taken to the police station, his fingerprints were run through the system, but a technical malfunction meant his true identity was never flagged or matched. After paying the administrative fine, Jones was released and left Georgia, spending several weeks in New Orleans, Louisiana. In late January 2004, he returned to Georgia. Shortly thereafter, he was arrested in Atlanta for trespassing, pleaded guilty as Chapman, and received 3 months in county jail. Upon release, he was arrested again for drug possession, pleaded guilty as Chapman once more, and the court showed leniency, handing him another 3-month sentence. Finally, following his September release, he left Georgia and headed to Alabama, and it was there that he murdered Lisa. During one police interview, Freeman let slip something she hadn't intended. She believed Jones was responsible for the death of Amanda Greenwell. That was a 16-year-old girl who had been their neighbor in Douglasville, Georgia. Amanda disappeared on March 12, 2004. Her body was found on March 21st. The autopsy revealed she had been raped, beaten, and her neck snapped. Following this lead from Freeman, investigators interrogated Jones again. During the interrogation, Jones flatly denied killing Amanda himself. However, strangely enough, he voluntarily confessed to 20 other murders, which spanned nearly 12 years and occurred across 5 states. 8 of these murders were difficult to investigate due to a lack of details, as Jones could not recall the victims' names or the locations where he had disposed of the bodies. The first murder Jones confessed to occurred in 1992. At that time, he had moved with his girlfriend to Baxter Springs, Kansas, to live with his high school friend Justin. On May 9th, Justin married Jennifer. However, just days after their wedding, while Justin was at work, someone broke into their home and stabbed Jennifer to death. During the initial investigation, based on Justin's testimony, Jones had been listed as a suspect, but with no credible evidence against him at the time, he was cleared. In his confession, Jones admitted to murdering Jennifer, and his motive was unrequited love. On February 21, 1996, Jones claimed he broke into the trailer of 38-year-old Daniel Oakley in Delaware County, Oklahoma, shot Oakley and his roommate Doris Harris, then burned the trailer down. After Jones's confession, the Miami Police Department reopened the investigation to verify his involvement, comparing his prints to fingerprints found inside Oakley's vehicle, but no match. In early September 1999, Jones said he wanted to buy drugs and met 19-year-old Justin Hutchings in Pitcher. On September 11th, he and Hutchings drank and used drugs at a local bar. Hours later, Hutchings died of an overdose in the street, and Jones claimed he had intentionally injected Hutchings with a lethal dose of methamphetamine laced with some unidentified chemical. On December 29, 1999, Jones claimed he committed a quadruple murder in Welch. The victims were 40-year-old Danny Freeman, his wife Kathy, their 16-year-old daughter Ashley, and her friend Loria. It was Ashley's birthday and Loria had come to celebrate. Jones said after entering the house he shot Danny and Kathy in the head at close range, set the house on fire, then forced the two girls at gunpoint to a wooded area near the Kansas border, where he raped and shot them. But the facts proved Jones was not the killer. In 2018, after a prolonged investigation, police arrested Ronnie Bissick, who, along with Warren Welch and David Pennington, was identified as the actual perpetrator. Jones's role in the case was merely that of a mistaken confessor. The next victim was 38-year-old Tina Mayberry. On October 31, 2002, after attending a Halloween party at a bar in Douglasville, Georgia, Mayberry was attacked while walking through the parking lot. Jones's version was that he met a woman dressed as Betty Boop at the bar, convinced her to leave with him, then assaulted her, stabbing her repeatedly in the chest and abdomen. Later, the bar owner and staff confirmed that Jones had indeed been a regular there before Mayberry's death, but without sufficient evidence, he was never charged. The last two murders Jones confessed to were those of 46-year-old Catherine Collins and 38-year-old Patrice Enders. According to Jones, in early January 2004, he met Catherine in New Orleans, Louisiana, raped and stabbed her, then finished her off with a jackhandle. On April 15th of that same year, Patrice was reported missing. Jones claimed he had entered her beauty salon merely to ask for directions, but during conversation learned she was alone in the shop. So he pulled a knife, forced her to empty the cash register, then drove her 65 miles to a wooded area where he raped and stabbed her to death. In order to support his claim, Jones even drew a map for investigators, but searches turned up nothing for a long time. It wasn't until December 2005 that Patrice's remains were found, over 10 miles away in Dawson County, nowhere near where Jones had pointed. Although he had confessed to numerous murders, based on the details of certain cases and investigations, Jones was formally indicted for only 3. In late 2004, he was charged with the murders of Lisa and Amanda. Then, in late January 2005, Catherine's murder was added. Jones's trial was originally scheduled for August 15, 2005, but his attorney requested a psychiatric evaluation first, causing a delay. That evaluation found that while Jones had mental health issues, he was competent to stand trial. On October 19th, the trial began. The prosecution relied mainly on Jones's confession and fingerprint evidence, Coleman's testimony, the murder weapon, and DNA test results. Even though Jones publicly retracted his confession and all previous serial killer claims, the jury still convicted him of Lisa's murder. On December 1, 2005, the judge formally sentenced him to death by lethal injection, telling Jones to his face that he was a danger to civilized society. Jones responded right there in court, "God will have the final say. One day I'll be a free man, I'll write me a book and laugh my ass off." Later, the charges in Amanda's and Catherine's cases were dropped. The first reason for this was that investigators lacked sufficient physical evidence in both cases. The second reason was that Jones was sitting on death row in Alabama, so any rush to prosecute the other cases was gone. Since entering the death row unit at Hallman Correctional Institution, Jones and his attorneys have been attempting to overturn his death sentence. However, in 2010, the state appellate court upheld the original verdict. Since then, the order for his execution by lethal injection has never been signed, and he has remained on death row. Time has passed, and he has not changed. He shows no remorse. In a prison interview, he said, "I am not going to beg for mercy. The ones who want me dead should be the ones begging for mercy." In the early 20th century, Cleveland rode the wave of industrialization to become America's sixth largest city, with its population surging from 160,000 to 900,000. But after the Great Depression of 1929, this city, so heavily dependent on heavy industry, was hit devastatingly hard. Unemployment soared past 30%, and most of those 900,000 residents found themselves plunged into economic ruin, losing their homes because they couldn't pay mortgages or rent. It was in this context that Kingsbury Run, a valley cutting through Cleveland's east side, became crowded with shantytowns built by the unemployed. It was a forgotten place, where the homeless slept under abandoned railway bridges, the jobless spent nights in freight cars, and prostitutes received clients in dim alleyways. And then came the Cleveland Torso Murderer. From 1934 to 1938, with chilling anatomical precision, he dismembered and decapitated his victims, casually tossing their torsos and severed limbs along the overgrown riverbanks. At least 13 people were killed, 7 men and 6 women. Criminologists called them the less dead, those whose deaths wouldn't draw society's attention. A historian later said that Kingsbury Run wasn't just a geographical valley, but a graveyard for the American dream, where people who had believed industrial cities would bring them a better life ended up losing their heads, their identities, even every trace of their existence. Elliot Ness, the legendary Prohibition agent famous for taking down Chicago gangsters, especially Al Capone, took on the case and launched a massive investigation. He even illegally detained a surgeon and interrogated him secretly in a hotel room. But this case became the biggest stain on his career. Not only did he damage the public interest, but the killer deliberately placed 2 victims' remains near Cleveland City Hall, within direct sight of his office window, and he never solved it. The Torso Killer's first victim was known as the Lady of the Lake, the most mysterious opening act of the case, and the very beginning of this string of murders. In September 1934, a man was taking his usual walk along the shore of Lake Erie when he came across a woman's body washed up on the beach. Or rather, what was left of her, just the lower half from waist to knee, both legs severed at the knees. The Cuyahoga County coroner, after conducting the autopsy, noted that the victim had died roughly 6 months prior, and her torso had been in the water for about 3 or 4 months. Possibly to slow the stench of decomposition, the killer had applied some kind of chemical preservative to her skin, leaving it red, tough, and leathery to the touch. What stood out was a distinctive mark on her abdomen, a surgical scar. So Cleveland police went through dozens of missing women reports from the past 6 months, but nobody matched that description of a scar on the abdomen. The Torso Killer was also known as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, and from this nickname alone it can tell the damage he inflicted on the place was impossible to ignore. In the Great Depression, Kingsbury Run was Cleveland's dark underbelly, where all manner of the unemployed, the homeless, the cast-offs of society had gathered. For the Torso Killer, this was his hunting ground. People came and went constantly, and the homeless people vanishing wouldn't raise a single eyebrow. A year after the Lady of the Lake was found, in September 1935, 2 teenage boys stumbled upon a naked male body at the foot of a hill in Kingsbury Run. His head was gone, his genitals cut off. The coroner determined the cause of death was decapitation. Fingerprint comparison later confirmed his identity. Edward Ondraschi, a 28-year-old white man who frequented a bar called the Roaring Third. Edward was the first victim to be identified, and in that sense, he was luckier than most, He wasn't one of the nameless souls of Kingsbury Run. The world had known him while he was alive. But the police search didn't end there. Near the same scene, they found a second body. Another white male, around 40 years old, also decapitated, also castrated. His skin coated with that same chemical preservative that had turned the Lady of the Lake's skin red and hard and leathery. And despite years of trying, this victim was never identified. Then came January 1936. A female worker, on her way home from her shift, spotted 2 baskets sitting beside a factory. They were wrapped tightly in newspaper. She took a look inside, and her scream brought the whole street running. Inside were the dismembered remains of a woman, decapitated like the others. Fingerprint analysis gave them a name: Florence Palelo, a waitress who occasionally worked as a bar hostess. She had lived just a few blocks from the Roaring Third. In June 1936, a morning in Kingsbury Run, 2 young boys found a human head wrapped inside a pair of trousers. The next day, Cleveland police located the rest of the body. A man in his 20s. He had 6 tattoos on his body. Since no one ever came forward to claim him, he became known as the Tattooed Man. Later, Cleveland police put a plaster cast of his head on display, alongside a chart of his tattoos. Over 100,000 people lined up to see it. Some took photos, others whispered among themselves. The Tattooed Man still has no name today, and that original plaster mask, along with 3 others, hangs on the wall of the Cleveland Police Museum to this day. In July 1936, a teenage girl was cutting through the woods on Cleveland's near west side when she found a head near Clinton Road and Big Creek. It belonged to a white man in his 40s, dead for about 2 months. The coroner later determined this was the primary crime scene because there was simply too much blood. Given the victim's unkempt hair, shabby clothes, and the proximity to a homeless encampment, he was presumed to be a vagrant. But his body was too decomposed to take fingerprints, and his identity remains unknown. September 1936, back in Kingsbury Run, a homeless man was trying to hop a slow-moving freight train when, running through the weeds along the embankment, he tripped over a man's body. No head, no legs, just the upper half of a torso. Cleveland police later found the lower half of the torso and both legs in an exposed sewer nearby. The coroner noted the victim was nearly 30 and that he had been decapitated while still alive. In February 1937, on the shore east of Bratenahl, almost exactly where the Lady of the Lake had been found, another woman's upper torso washed up. 2 women, the same stretch of shoreline. It was this pattern that finally confirmed the Lady of the Lake as the Cleveland torso killer's very first victim. In June 1937, the 8th victim turned up. A rotting sack containing newspapers from June 1936 and partial female remains that had been dead for about a year. At first, she was identified as a missing prostitute named Rose Wallace. Police chased this lead, checked Rose's dental records, talked to her neighbors, and came up with absolutely nothing. Rose had vanished, and whether the woman in the sack was her, the authorities never said. That summer of 1937, labor disputes in the Flats district had gotten out of hand, and the National Guard moved in to keep order. One young guardsman was stationed on a bridge on the west side late at night when a tugboat passed underneath. A piece of human remains surfaced in its wake. Over the next few days, police dragged the river and recovered everything except the head. The coroner's examination revealed something even more horrifying this time. The killer hadn't just decapitated the victim, he'd hollowed out the abdominal cavity and taken the heart with him. In April 1938, a young worker was walking along the bank of the Cuyahoga River, heading to his morning shift in the Flats. Something was floating on the water. At first he thought it was a dead fish, but as he got closer, he realized it was a woman's leg, severed below the knee. It wasn't until a month later that Cleveland police pulled 2 sacks from the river and finally pieced together most of this female victim's remains. August 16, 1938. 3 junk collectors were rummaging through a dump, looking for anything they could sell, when they pulled aside a pile of rotting cardboard boxes and saw a man's double-breasted blue suit jacket. Inside was a woman's torso. Nearby lay a box wrapped in brown butcher paper, containing her legs, her arms, and her head. While Cleveland police were expanding their search of the area, they found a second body just yards away. This place was only a few streets from Ness's office, close enough to see from his window. It was as if the torso killer had left it there to mock him. By the time, after Prohibition was repealed, the legendary lawman, Elliot Ness, had seen his special task force disbanded and himself reassigned to alcohol tax enforcement. Then he got an invitation from Cleveland Mayor Burton to come to Cleveland with the title of Public Safety Director, overseeing police, fire, the entire city's public safety apparatus. What Burton needed from him was reform, cleaning up a corrupt police force, rooting out the rot. But by 1936, while he was busy ousting corrupt sheriffs and reorganizing the department, the torso killer had already claimed 6 victims. The press had gone absolutely wild. The Cleveland Press, the Cleveland News, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, all 3 running daily stories on the murders and suspects. Who was the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run? The question was practically staring the public in the face. Burton's pressure kept mounting. He needed an answer, a scapegoat. He needed this case to end on his watch. So he thrust Ness into the spotlight, and Ness was forced to transform from a city reformer into a hunter chasing the torso killer. August 18th, just 2 days after those 2 new victims were found. In the early morning hours, Ness led 35 police officers and detectives in a raid on the largest homeless encampment in Kingsbury Run. His team pushed through from north to south, searching every corner, and in the end they found nothing. No killer, no murder weapon, not a shred of evidence pointing to the Mad Butcher. So after arresting 63 people, Ness stood there on the riverbank, looked at those crooked shanties, and ordered them burned to the ground. The next day, the press tore him apart. The Chicago hero had become, in their eyes, an arsonist, a tyrant. Most of those 63 so-called suspects were released the very next day. Ness had arrested them without any legitimate grounds for detention, and he'd burned down the homes of thousands of homeless people. By this point, frankly, Ness was reeling from public backlash and the crushing pressure of being forced to solve the torso killer case. Not long after, Ness illegally arrested a man named Francis Sweeney. Francis was a surgeon with a history of alcoholism and drug abuse, and he possessed the professional anatomical knowledge the coroner had described. In a hotel room, Ness administered 2 polygraph tests to Francis. He failed both. The polygraph expert told Ness that Francis was their man, but Ness never charged him because Francis had a cousin, Martin, who was a U.S. congressman, Ness's political enemy, no less, and had publicly demanded to know when Ness would finally catch the killer. Charging the cousin of a congressman, an unstable doctor with war trauma and alcohol dependency, would have been virtually impossible to make stick. Later, Francis voluntarily committed himself to a veterans hospital where he would regularly send threatening postcards to Ness and his family. Whether Francis was actually the killer is hard to say with any certainty. All the evidence was circumstantial. But once he was institutionalized, the murders stopped. In 1929, Francis had been a surgical resident at St. Alexis Hospital, right near Kingsbury Run. He'd rented an office there, right next to the coroner's morgue. Clean, private, with an autopsy table. A man named Emil Fronek had even filed a police report in 1934 saying a doctor had tried to drug him, and the location he described was right near Francis's office. As a surgeon, Francis had access to the drugs, and when sober, he had the skill to handle those victims like surgical specimens. As for whether he had alibis, no concrete information was ever released. Maybe Francis was the closest Ness ever got to an answer, but he was too desperate to close the case, and too wary of Francis's cousin's political clout. He couldn't bring himself to arrest Francis publicly. Then there was another suspect. In July 1939, a county sheriff named Martin arrested 52-year-old Frank, charging him with Polilo's murder. She had lived with him for a while, and Frank had also been connected to Edward and Rose. At first, Frank confessed to killing Polillo. Then he recanted, claiming police had beaten the confession out of him. Not long after, Frank was found dead in his cell at Cuyahoga County Jail. Official cause, suicide by hanging. But when the coroner examined Frank's body, he found 6 broken ribs, all fractured during his time in custody. Clearly, Frank was almost certainly not the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. He looked far more like a scapegoat, a sacrificial lamb trotted out so the police could announce a breakthrough in the newspapers. In the end, the Cleveland Torso Killer remains one of the most baffling cases in American criminal history. And here's what makes it even more haunting. Virtually all the official records, thousands of interview transcripts, autopsy photographs, fingerprint cards, suspect files were lost, destroyed, or simply erased. He was not some strange, far-out type person. He was just a normal person who loved to kill. If you made him mad, he would kill. One of the investigators involved in the serial murder investigation said in an interview, "On May 13, 1992, Fabienne Witherspoon, a young woman from Charleston, West Virginia, was driving under an overpass when she spotted a scruffy man holding a cardboard sign that read, 'I will work for food.' After seeing this, she pulled over to the side of the road. The man went up to her window and pulled a photo of his wife and child from his pocket. 19-year-old Fabienne, who had only just started living on her own, was moved by compassion and decided to take him home to get him some food so he could fill his empty stomach. Fabienne asked him to wait outside while she went inside to get the food. However, as soon as she got to the kitchen doorway, the man took the chance to force his way in. Initially, she thought he was just starving and had forgotten his manners. She didn't turn around to look, did not see him quietly pull a kitchen knife from the block. It all went exactly as you'd expect when you invite a wolf into your home. He got the knife and immediately made Fabienne go into the bathroom, where he tried to sexually assault her. Inside the bathroom, Fabienne was paralyzed with terror, but when the man began tearing at her clothes, her survival instinct kicked in. She grabbed a ceramic duck from the bathroom counter and smashed it with all her strength against the man's skull. Then, while he was in pain, she grabbed his knife and stabbed him in the stomach and thighs as much as she could. Later, Fabienne woke up in the hospital with stitches in her head and bandages wrapped around her palms, while the man, whom she had lacerated in the liver, kidneys, and testicles, had been taken to the intensive care unit and placed under police custody. During the interview, the 19-year-old girl said, "I just wanted to get away and I didn't realize I had stabbed him. And it was very, very, very hard to know that I had the capability of hurting someone like that. I always felt if something like that ever happened to me, I would faint and die. I would not fight, but I found out that I was somebody different." Nevertheless, fortunately, she was not among the victims who lost their lives because the man who attacked her was no ordinary person. He was a serial killer, the coast-to-coast killer Tommy Lynn Sells. I felt a surge of power like from a dose of a drug. People don't matter, it's about the crime itself. The feeling of blood, I got hooked on those sharp sensations. When Sells spoke these chilling words, he was not exaggerating. For him, murder was not an action of rage, revenge, or even necessity. It was an addiction, a dark, intoxicating high that consumed his life. From California to Texas, from the Midwest to the South, he killed indiscriminately. Children, women, strangers he barely knew. His description of murder as a rush stronger than any drug revealed the true horror of his psyche. He killed for the feeling, not the reason. On June 28, 1964, Sells and his twin sister Tammy were born in Oakland, California. Their mother was single and they had 3 other siblings. However, tragedy struck when the twins were only 18 months old. Both Sells and Tammy contracted meningitis. Only Sells survived. After that, the young Sells was sent to Holcomb, Missouri, to be raised by his Aunt Bonnie. There, he lived a good life, and Bonnie treated him as her own child. She even wanted to adopt a boy. However, upon hearing of Bonnie's intentions to adopt Sells, his biological mother immediately took him back into her custody, but she soon began to neglect him. At the age of 7, Sells started regularly drinking alcohol from his grandfather's stash. In less than a year later, he began hanging out with an adult man called Willis Clark. However, Sells later said that this man had sexually abused him, and further claiming that his mother not only knew about it, but actually condoned and encouraged the relationship. This incident left a permanent scar on his psyche. Sowell said that when committing his crimes, he would relive those experiences. At 13, under the influence of narcotics, Sowell was found lying naked in his grandmother's bed. Then, he was thrown out of the house. This was not his first encounter with narcotics. 3 years prior, he had already been secretly using narcotics to chase thrills. After being expelled from the home, worse followed in quick succession. His mother left hometown with his other siblings and family members without goodbye, without explanation. And this abandonment became the turning point in Sowell's life. By that time, 14-year-old Sowell had no home to call his own and was forced to live on the streets. 3 years later, in 1981, Sowell was still homeless. He spent those 3 years hitchhiking and hopping freight trains, wandering aimlessly across the country. He drank heavily, took drugs, and committed numerous petty crimes, burglary and robbery. At the time, he decided to visit relatives in Little Rock, Arkansas, where his mother had moved. However, upon arriving there, he attempted to molest his mother while she was bathing, and once again, he was angrily thrown out of the house. From then on, his relationship with his family became extremely hostile. His family members denied his existence, and himself made no secret of his contempt for them, especially his mother. During a prison interview, Sowell said, "I am hate. When you look at me, you look at hate. I don't know what love is. Love and sorry are two words I don't like to use, because I'm all about hate." In 1982, Sowell was arrested for public intoxication, but that was only one part of his long history of crime. After his release, he continued his wandering existence. During this period, he held several manual labor jobs, though all were short-lived. What he engaged in more frequently were burglary, robbery, assault, and even murder. He claimed to have killed more than 70 people, and investigators have linked him to at least 22 murders. I know there's a lot more. Obviously, we'll never know the exact number, retired Texas Ranger John Allen said. On July 31, 1983, in St. Louis, Missouri, Sowell beat 4-year-old Tiffany and 33-year-old Colleen to death with a baseball bat. On July 26, 1985, in Springfield, Missouri, Sowell met 28-year-old Court and her 4-year-old son Rory. That same evening, Court made the fatal mistake of inviting the wolf into her home. She invited Sowell over as a guest. There, he killed Court and Rory with Rory's own baseball bat. On May 1, 1987, Sowell murdered 27-year-old Suzanne in New York State. On November 17th, Sowell slaughtered an entire family of 4 in Ena, Illinois. He first shot 29-year-old Keith to death, then used a baseball bat to bludgeon to death Keith's 3-year-old son, his 30-year-old pregnant wife, Elaine, and their newborn baby. On December 18, 1988, he slit the throat of 51-year-old Kent in Tucson, Arizona. On December 9, 1991, Sowell arrived in Marianna, Florida, where he beat 25-year-old Teresa and her 5-year-old daughter to death with a wooden table leg. Sowell was nicknamed the Coast-to-Coast Killer because he moved around the lot, hopping freight trains, hitchhiking, and stealing cars. He used no credit cards, wrote no checks, and made no phone calls, conducting all transactions entirely in cash. In this manner, he was virtually the perfect predator, extraordinarily difficult for investigators to track. One investigator said, "If you or I drove across the United States, we would be fairly easy to follow. We use credit cards and telephones, but this guy takes trains, uses no credit cards, doesn't use checks. It's kind of like chasing a ghost." In 1992, Sowell met Fabienne. He did not kill her. Instead, due to her resistance, he suffered serious injuries and was sentenced to 2 to 10 years in prison after signing a plea agreement for malicious wounding. While in prison, Sowell was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and married a woman named Nora, his first legal marriage. After his release in 1997, Sowell and Nora moved to Tennessee, but he repeatedly abandoned her to continue his interstate killing spree. October 13, 1997, Sowell murdered 10-year-old Joel in Lawrenceville, Illinois. 2 days later, he returned to Springfield and killed 13-year-old Stephanie. Sowell said that he had abducted Stephanie at night, taken her to a field, injected her with cocaine, raped her, and then strangled her to death. On April 4, 1999, he murdered 31-year-old Deborah and her 8-year-old daughter Halliburton in Gibson. On July 5th, he shot and killed 14-year-old Wofford in Oklahoma. Although Sowell claimed to dozens of murders and investigators confirmed at least 22 of them, he was formally charged and convicted of only 2. The first case occurred on April 18, 1999, during the annual Fiesta celebration in San Antonio, Texas, when he abducted 9-year-old Mary. He first sexually assaulted Mary, then strangled her to death. The other case was the one that led to his arrest, involving 13-year-old Katie and 10-year-old Crystal, the latter being the only victim to escape from his knife and assist in his conviction. The case took place in Del Rio, Texas. Prior to the case, Sowell had met Katie's father, Harris, at Grace Community Church, and had once visited Harris's home under the pretense of marriage counseling. On December 31, 1999, learning that Harris would be away, Sowell chose to strike. Armed with an 11-inch butcher knife, he slipped into Harris's trailer home through a window. At the time, Katie and Crystal were sleeping in a room with bunk beds, Katie on the bottom bunk and Crystal on the top. While the 2 girls were sleeping, Sowell first lay down beside Katie, cut off her underwear, and fondled her genitals. Then, Katie was awakened by his movements and screamed out, telling Crystal to go for help. Hearing Katie's screams, Crystal lifted her head slightly and saw a man with long hair, a thick beard, and fierce eyes. She witnessed with her own eyes as Sowell covered Katie's mouth with one hand and used the knife in his other hand to slit Katie's throat. After killing Katie, Sowell saw Crystal hiding on the top bunk. He then walked over to her and likewise slit her throat with the knife. Believing both girls were dead, he then wiped down the doorknob, took the window screen that might have retained his fingerprints, and discarded the knife and the screen in a field behind the house. However, Crystal did not die. After hearing Sowell leave, she crawled over to Katie's side. Hearing her friend emit choking, gurgling sounds, she tried to comfort her only to discover that she herself could not speak because her trachea and vocal cords had also been severed. Realizing she had to get help from others, the little girl saw lights in the distance in the darkness. So, she began walking toward them, repeating silently in her mind, "Get to that house, just get to that house." After walking a quarter of a mile, she knocked on a door. Unable to speak, she wrote in blood-stained letters, "Harris, house hurt. Tell them hurry. My neck needs help. Will I live?" In the end, after undergoing surgery at the University Hospital in San Antonio, Crystal worked with a forensic sketch artist to draw a portrait of Sowell from memory, and she immediately identified him from a photo array. At 5:30 a.m. on January 2, 2000, police arrested Sowell at the trailer home where he was living. Sowell did not resist. He simply stood in the doorway and said one thing, "I'm glad I finally got caught. I'm tired of this." According to reports, Katie's father, Harris, told the Kansas City Star, "Sowell uprooted our family in just 10 minutes. He stole my daughter's accomplishments. Every birthday, every holiday. I'm in agony. I tried to help him. I talked to him. He was a down-on-his-luck guy. I tried to help him, and he repaid me by killing my daughter." On September 18, 2000, the jury found Sowell guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. While in prison, he confessed to killing Mary and received an additional life sentence without parole. At the time, Crystal identified Sowell in court, displayed her scars, and demonstrated how she had lifted her head to see her attacker. The defense attorney responded, "You are a brave girl. Thank you. I have no questions." April 3, 2014. Sowell's death sentence was carried out at the Texas State Prison in Huntsville. Crystal, Harris, and Mary's family members attended his execution. When asked if he would like to make a final statement, Sowell replied, "No." On March 15, 2000, inside San Quentin State Prison in California, Darrell Rich, the serial killer known as the Hilltop Rapist, was executed in the execution chamber. Just days earlier, at his clemency hearing, multiple victims' families had vented their fury. He's an animal, a man of evil desires who had shown no mercy and deserves none. A man named Burton Adams put it even more bluntly, "A lethal injection is far too kind. Maybe we should take him to that dump and use that rock." Their anger dates back 22 years to that summer, when Darrell sexually assaulted 9 women and girls, 4 of whom were murdered, and the youngest victim was just 11. The brutality was shocking. He repeatedly hit his victims on the head with rocks until they died. Burton's sister, The 17-year-old Patricia Moore was lured to a remote area where she was not only raped and had her skull shattered with rocks. Daryl's final statement was the word, peace, yet he had never shown of mercy in his life. On June 13, 1978, in Redding, California, a 25-year-old woman was walking alone across a bridge in the sweltering afternoon heat. It was there that 23-year-old Daryl intercepted her, tried to coax her down to the riverbank beneath the bridge to carry out his intention, sexual assault. When she refused, Daryl picked up a rock and hit her repeatedly on the head until her skull fractured. 12 hours later, she was found under the bridge. That was the opening chapter of Daryl's string of sexual violence. Barely 6 days later, on June 19th, Daryl stopped a 21-year-old woman on the street. With no one watching, he dragged her into his car and drove straight to a desolate area where he raped her. Afterward, the terrified woman, fearing he would kill her to silence her, told him she had a newborn baby at home who needed her care. These words saved her. Daryl let her go. Yet that very evening, he was bragging to his friends about how easy it was to attack women. On June 25th, Daryl abducted and sexually assaulted a 14-year-old girl. Then, on July 4th, he attacked 2 girls. The first was a 19-year-old girl. He assaulted her and then sent home. The second was 19-year-old Annette Edwards, who had just finished watching the Independence Day fireworks and was on her way home when she ran into Daryl. He dragged her to a spot near an embankment, raped her, and crushed her skull with a rock. 3 days later, her body was found just 2 miles from her apartment. 2 weeks after that, Daryl stopped a 15-year-old girl on her bicycle, pulled her into the roadside bush, raped her, and let her go. At that time, he became increasingly skilled at this approach and grew bolder and bolder. On August 2nd, 17-year-old Patricia Moore vanished. 4 days later, on August 6th, 27-year-old Linda Slavic also vanished. Then, on August 13th, 11-year-old Annette Selix was kidnapped while walking to a nearby market to buy groceries. The next day, her body was found under the John Creek Bridge in Shasta County, naked except for her underwear. The autopsy painted a horrifying picture. Annette had been raped, forced into oral sex, and bore teeth marks on her thigh. Multiple fractures, massive internal bleeding, and the fact that her body was curled into a fetal position all pointed to one unbearable truth. After being thrown from the bridge, Annette hadn't died immediately. She had suffered terribly before the end finally came. Soon, the Redding Police Department and the Shasta County Sheriff's Office launched their investigation. Annette's death fit all too neatly into the pattern of abductions and sexual assaults that had been plaguing the Redding area since June 13, 1978. Young women and girls approached by a male attacker, forcibly taken to remote areas or hilltops and raped. Because of these signature characteristics, the attacker had been dubbed the Hilltop Rapist. Almost 2 days later, someone at a garbage dump stumbled upon a woman's body. When police and the coroner arrived at the scene, the deceased was identified as Patricia, who had been missing for 2 weeks. She had been sexually assaulted, her skull severely deformed, several teeth broken, and the cause of death was confirmed as head trauma from blunt force injuries. While officers were still combing the area, they found a second body just 20 feet from Patricia. It was Linda, also sexually assaulted, but unlike Patricia, she had been shot. 2 bullets were found in her body. One had struck her neck, the other her mouth, severing her spinal cord and killing her instantly. August 20th. An anonymous caller reported to police that Daryl had told him about a body found at a garbage dump, the very same dump where Patricia and Linda had been found. The next day, officers brought Daryl in for questioning. He agreed to take a polygraph test and failed it, but without hard evidence, they had no choice but to let him go. Yet shortly after, another call came in. This time, the caller claimed Daryl had been boasting about his involvement in multiple murders, claiming he'd been paid $7,000 for a murder. He had even mimicked Linda's final pleas of, don't do it, and said Patricia was at the wrong place at the wrong time. August 23rd, police arrested Daryl while he was drinking at a bar in Redding. Meanwhile, the physical evidence collected from multiple crime scenes finally broke through. Semen samples, hairs left behind by the attacker, survivors' statements, forensic traces of tire impressions and fibers, and the bite marks on Annetta's body, all of it pointed squarely at Darryl, and the gun used to kill Linda was also found at his foster mother's home. Then, Darryl confessed to everything: the sexual assaults on 9 women and girls, and the murders of Edwards, Patricia, Linda, and Annette. During a 2-hour interrogation, he said, "The only reason I got caught is because I wanted to get caught." On January 23, 1981, the jury found Darryl guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances and 1 count of second-degree murder, sentencing him to death for 2 of the 4 killings. During his nearly 2 decades on death row at San Quentin, every appeal he filed was denied, and his execution date was ultimately set for March 15, 2000. When reviewing the appeals, Ninth Circuit Judge Michael summarized his crimes. To even the most hardened eye, the crimes were almost unimaginably brutal, savage attacks on defenseless young women, all sexually ravaged. 4 were also murdered, 2 bludgeoned to death, a 3rd shot in the face, and a 4th, an 11-year-old girl, thrown off a 100-foot bridge to her death. During the trial, Darryl's attorneys leaned heavily on his childhood, a domineering foster mother, his parents' divorce, suicidal tendencies as a teenager, chronic alcoholism. They framed his crimes as evidence of escalating violence, portraying him as a man whose mind had gradually unraveled until it finally snapped. But were these claims merely an attempt to shift blame, or did they truly explain the root causes of the violence? On February 14, 1955, Darryl was born in California and adopted as a young child by a Mormon family in Cottonwood. His foster mother was a domineering woman who treated caring for other people's children as a job, and this bred resentment. Darryl, he grew jealous of the attention those children received, and this over time until it became something far more serious. During elementary school, a school psychologist actually flagged Darryl's psychological issues, writing in his report that this child could turn violent in the future. But the report was ignored. No follow-up treatment, no intervention whatsoever. At 15, after his foster parents divorced, he started drinking heavily. At 17, following an argument with his girlfriend, he walked into the woods with a gun, claiming he was going hunting. In reality, he shot himself in the chest, his first clear suicide attempt. Not long after, he fired at a passing police car, hoping the officers would return fire and kill him. Both suicide attempts failed, and Darryl was arrested for assault with a deadly weapon and sent to the California Youth Authority. The psychiatric evaluation determined he was suicidal and needed immediate treatment. He refused. In 1975, Darryl married his girlfriend and had a child. On the surface, this looked like the beginning of a young man getting his life back on track. But in April 1976, a bicycle collision left his face injured and his nose permanently scarred. This accident seemed to deepen both his mental instability and his drinking. He stopped directing violence at himself and started aiming it at the people. His wife was the first to bear the brunt. He subjected her to physical and verbal abuse. So, a child who had once been neglected and tormented grew up to become an abusive alcoholic, and finally, in the summer, he turned into the nightmare of 9 women. In early 2000, as his execution date drew near, Darryl petitioned then-Governor Gray Davis for clemency, citing his model behavior in prison and his remorse. On March 7th, Gray Davis formally denied the request, emphasizing the sheer brutality of Darryl's crimes against his young victims. Victims' families' testimony formed the most crushing part of that clemency hearing. Annetta's aunt spoke of 22 years of agony, describing how Annetta's mother plays her child's death over and over in her mind. "I'm here to plead for mercy," she said. "Certainly not for Darryl Rich, but for us, the families of all his victims. Execute him and let him go to hell." One survivor said, "He has taken my ability to live in peace." Burton Adams, Patricia's brother, hadn't learned the full details of his sister's murder until the night before the hearing. Burton said, "A lethal injection is far too kind. Maybe we should take him to the dump and use a rock or maybe a gun. No, a gun's too lenient." On March 15, 2000, inside San Quentin State Prison, Darryl refused a last meal. He only drank beef broth, papaya juice, and Gatorade. At 12:13 a.m., he died in the execution chamber. Early on the morning of January 29, 2002, Stephen Wayne Anderson lay down on the gurney in the execution chamber at San Quentin State Prison. 48 hours earlier, then California Governor Gray Davis had denied his clemency request in a 34-page written decision. From when he became a professional burglar at the age of 17 in 1971, to when he shot an elderly woman without hesitation in 1980, and all the way to his execution in 2002, Anderson's criminal record spanned 2 states and included at least 3 murders. The policeman who arrested him wrote to the governor, "During my 25 years in law enforcement, I have come across a lot of cold-blooded individuals, but in my opinion, Stephen Wayne Anderson is without doubt the coldest I have ever dealt with." Anderson's confession in the interrogation room was even more chilling. "I was born and trained to be a killer. I always wanted to be a killer." July 8, 1953, Anderson was born in St. Louis, Missouri, the older of 2 children. On the surface, his family looked like a textbook dual-income household. Dad worked in the oil, Mom was a court clerk. But the reality was a household held together with fraying thread. Both of Anderson's parents carried their own psychological problems. His father wasn't just a drunk, he was a violent one, and Stephen and his younger brother bore the brunt of it physically. His mother went the other way entirely, emotional neglect. She actually told Anderson that she dreaded the days that you boys were born, and she told neighbors she preferred her dogs to her children. Although he never felt an ounce of parental love, Anderson, being the older son, still tried to hold the family together. As a little kid, he'd change his brother's diapers for his mother, take on chores hoping to lighten her load and maybe lift her mood. And when the abuse started, he'd throw himself between his parents and his brother to shield him. But when Anderson talked about his childhood, something strange happened. His father, he insisted, was a good, fair man. And the violence, that was just the trauma of losing friends in World War II. As for his mother, her mental unraveling wasn't her fault. She'd been framed for embezzlement, made the fall guy for a corrupt judge, and did time for it. Because of his mother's prison record and his own slight build, Anderson caught hell at school. The other kids called him son of a jailbird and Tweety Bird. In 1971, the family moved to Farmington, New Mexico. At the time, Anderson had just turned 17, but after taking the fall for a party his brother threw, his mother threw him out. No roof, just the street. So he did what he had to do to survive, became a professional burglar. He started breaking into churches and schools, stealing whatever he could carry. Not long after, he got picked up for burglarizing a Farmington school, and there were accusations that he'd been carrying a rifle and had squared off against 2 police officers. That November, at 18, he caught his first serious sentence, 1 to 5 years in Utah for aggravated burglary. By 1973, they'd tacked on 3 more aggravated burglary convictions. In 1975, they shipped him off to the Utah State Prison, but if anyone thought incarceration would straighten him out, they were dead wrong. During a movie screening in the prison hall, he pulled a knife and stabbed another inmate. In November 1979, Anderson walked away from a prison work furlough and vanished. For the next several months, he was a ghost. No home, no address, just riding freight trains from one place to the next. Then came May 26, 1980, the eve of Memorial Day. Dressed head to toe in black, gloved hands, Anderson slipped into a house in Bloomington, California. The place belonged to Elizabeth Lyman, an 81-year-old retired piano teacher. He'd been watching the neighborhood for days. That night, Anderson downed half a bottle of vodka, then cut Elizabeth's phone line with a knife. Just after 1 in the morning, he pried open the glass on a French door and let himself in. Moving through the pitch-black house, he checked room by room, trying to figure out if she was home. Later, Anderson would claim he'd been after a car, but after searching the place, he found she didn't have one. He pushed open the bedroom door, and Elizabeth woke to a shadow standing over her bed, and she started screaming, hoping someone in the neighborhood would hear. Anderson didn't hesitate. He raised a .45 caliber pistol and fired one shot into her face from less than 2 feet away. When he was sure she'd stopped breathing, he grabbed the blanket and covered her body, then bent down to pick up the shell casing. With an IQ of 136, Anderson very well knew that shell casing could carry his fingerprints and barrel markings, evidence that would bury him. Then he went to work searching the house for anything of value. The exact amount he took remains murky. Most news reports put it under $100. In a private letter, Anderson himself claimed 80. Court records estimated around 112. But either way, he killed an 81-year-old woman for pocket change. After murdering Elizabeth, Anderson stayed in her house for nearly 2 hours. He cooked himself a bowl of macaroni and eggs in her kitchen, then sat down in the living room and watched TV. However, Elizabeth's neighbor had heard the gunshot and called the police immediately. At 3:47 a.m., officers arrived and arrested him. The irony is almost too much to stomach. The black clothes, the gloves, the cut phone line, the shell casing, all that careful effort to leave no trace. And then he decides to hang around for 2 hours eating macaroni and watching TV until the officers literally knocked on the door. Over the next few days, Anderson was held at a substation in Fontana and interrogated twice. The first came 3 hours after his arrest, conducted by 2 officers from the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Office. He admitted to killing Elizabeth and confessed he was a fugitive. While waiting for Utah officials to arrive, the officers kept pressing him about other crimes. That's when Anderson claimed responsibility for 8 additional murders: his cellmate Robert Blundell, his client Timothy Glashin, and 6 contract killings in Las Vegas. Anderson only gave detailed confessions for 2 of those killings, Robert and Timothy. On August 24, 1977, while locked up in Utah State Prison, Anderson got into an argument with Robert in the prison kitchen. Robert was known as a snitch, and on his way out, he threw a sexual threat at Anderson. That was it. Humiliated and furious, Anderson grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed him in the back, killing him. The Timothy case came after Anderson escaped from Utah State Prison. By then, he became involved with drug traffickers and started working as a hitman. On February 22, 1980, in Salt Lake County, Utah, a motorcycle gang member named Ace Fairbanks invited Anderson along to discuss a marijuana deal. Timothy Gran was their buyer. During the exchange, Ace grew suspicious. He thought Timothy might be a police informant. So Ace and Anderson drove him out to Mill Creek Canyon. There, Ace handed Anderson $1,000 to kill Timothy. Then Anderson pulled out that same .45 caliber pistol and fired 4 shots into Timothy. They left the body right there, figuring nobody would stumble across it. However, the body was found the very next day, and Anderson ended up hiding out in the canyon for months. This case wasn't until June 2015 that the Unified Police Department of Greater Salt Lake announced they'd gathered enough evidence through ballistic forensics to confirm Anderson and Ace as the killers. By then, of course, Anderson had already been executed 13 years prior, and Ace had died of illness long before that. The statute of limitations had run out too. As for those other 6 contract killings, one of the officers involved in Anderson's arrest was openly skeptical. He said he believed Anderson was good for the first 2 murders. The man remembered too many specific details for it to be fabrication. But the other 6? The officer had reached out to investigators across multiple jurisdictions, and nobody could find a single case matching Anderson's descriptions. No files, no corroboration. In the second interrogation on May 28th, Anderson reaffirmed the Robert and Timothy murders. He also told investigators plain as day, "I was born and trained to be a killer. I always wanted to be a killer." But come trial time, Anderson's story splintered apart. He admitted to killing Elizabeth, flatly denied the Timothy murder, and claimed Robert's death was self-defense. His defense team threw out the entire Vegas contract killing narrative entirely. They even brought in a psychiatrist to argue that something was fundamentally wrong with Anderson's brain, that the booze had hijacked his judgment the night he shot Elizabeth. However, the California Department of Corrections psychiatrist wasn't having any of it. Anderson had no mental illness, no disorder, nothing. The prosecution seized on that one sentence. I was a born killer. They hammered it through the trial, through every appeal. Anderson tried to walk it back, calling it nothing but jailhouse bravado. The prosecution's response was devastating. You don't brag about being a killer if you're genuinely remorseful. Those two things don't live in the same house. On May 6, 1981, the jury convicted Anderson of first-degree murder with special circumstances, and the death sentence came down on July 24th. During the penalty phase opening statement, the prosecutor made Anderson's violent prison history the beating heart of his argument for death. Standing before the jury, his tone carried something close to a warning. So remember that when you consider what he's done and what he's testified to, this particular individual is a sociopath. He cannot live with anybody. He cannot get along with anybody. He kills people everywhere. He stabs people everywhere. He has stabbed an individual in prison. There is no place that anybody is going to be safe from this individual. He looks out for old number one, and that's all he's concerned with, and forget about the rest of the world. For over 2 decades on death row, Anderson filed appeal after appeal, trying to overturn his conviction. Nothing stuck. But the man had time on his hands, endless, crawling time, and he used it. He taught himself Latin. He wrote poems, short stories, a play, even started a novel. His work started getting attention, won 2 awards, earned an honorable mention from PN America's Prison Writing Award, and one of his poems became the foundation for an off-Broadway play called Lament from Death Row. His supporters called him the Poet Laureate of the Condemned. Because of his literary achievements and what looked like genuine remorse, writers, human rights activists, and a circle of supporters launched a clemency campaign. Remarkably, even Elizabeth's and Robert's families got behind it, and asking that his sentence be commuted to life without parole. But both the U.S. Supreme Court and then Governor Gray Davis shut it down. Davis, in a 34-page written decision, pointed out that Anderson had called himself a professional burglar and hitman, and his record proved he meant it. One policeman on the case, Dennis, wrote to Gray, "During my 25 years in law enforcement, I have come across a lot of cold-blooded individuals, but in my opinion, Stephen Wayne Anderson is without doubt the coldest I have ever dealt with. I think that if you had any item that Anderson wanted, he would kill you and take it without giving it a second thought. The death penalty is a fair and just punishment for him." Anderson chose lethal injection. The night before, his attorney advised him to stay awake, to exhaust himself so the end will come easier. He refused and said, wanted to feel it all as repentance. On January 29, 2002, around midnight, over 200 protesters gathered outside San Quentin, holding a candlelight vigil for him. 30 minutes later, at 12:30 a.m., Anderson was pronounced dead, left no final words. He was the 10th person executed in California since the state brought back the death penalty in 1978. After cremation, his ashes were sent to an unnamed friend in Farmington. His life looks like a tragedy on loop, childhood abuse spiraling into lifelong violence. On July 1, 1977, a middle-aged man with glasses walked into the Riverside County Sheriff's Office with his friend. His name was Patrick Kearney. The friend beside him was David Hill, his live-in partner. Kearney pointed at a wanted poster on the wall and told the officers, "Wear them." Kearney had been in the Air Force. After that, he worked as an engineer for Hughes Aircraft. But for 15 years, he'd been living a completely different life, one that had nothing to do with that mild-mannered facade. In Southern California, he'd pick up young male hitchhikers, lure them into his car, shoot them with a handgun, drive them back home, have sex with the corpses, then dismember them and stuff the pieces into industrial trash bags, dumped like garbage along highways and in remote areas. No struggle, no chase, no dramatic standoff. Kearney, later known as the trash bag killer, the Freeway Killer, simply ended his own reign of terror. What made it even more disturbing was his plea deal. In order to dodge the death penalty, he walked the officers through his kills like he was doing inventory, even leading them to the corpses. He cooperated so perfectly that Judge Paul Breckenridge Jr. couldn't help but say at sentencing, I would only hope that the Community Release Board will never see fit to parole Mr. Kearney because he appears to be an insult to humanity. On September 24, 1939, Kearney was born in East Los Angeles into a relatively stable middle-class family. His father was a Los Angeles Police Department officer, his mother a stay-at-home housewife, and he had 2 brothers. But Kearney's early years weren't without their scars. Small and physically frail, he became target practice for schoolyard bullies from elementary school on. They beat him bloody and hurled gay slurs at him. Sissy, queer. Ironically, by all accounts, Kearney was actually more interested in girls. The bullying left its mark. As a teenager, Kearney grew quiet, withdrawn, his inner world curdling into something dark. He started fantasizing about killing people, and not just killing them, but skinning them alive. Dominant sexual fantasies took root alongside the violence. Years later, Kearney would admit in his police confession that at 13, he'd had sex with the family dog, one of his earliest sexual experiences. In order to straighten the boy out, his father bought him a .22 rifle. The officer taught his son to shoot pigs and chickens, explaining that the cleanest shot was just above and behind the pig's ear, minimal blood, bullet lodged in the brain. Maybe he thought this blood-soaked lesson would toughen up his soft son. However, it just perfected the technique Kearney would later use on human beings. Later, the Kearney family moved to Willcox, Arizona. His father switched careers to become a travel salesman, while Kearney enrolled in the local high school. The bullying never really stopped, but he did pick up fluent Spanish along the way. After graduation, he followed his parents to Dallas, worked a string of odd jobs, and in 1958, enlisted in the Air Force, stationed in Texas. It was during his service that Kearney met David Hill through a friend of a friend. They made an odd pair, Kearney at 5'7" and scrawny, Hill at 6'2" and built like a linebacker. Their on-again, off-again gay relationship would stretch across the next 15 years. In 1961, Kearney got his honorable discharge, and the 2 of them moved in together in Long Beach, California. By 1962, it fell apart. Hill went back to Lubbock and reconciled with his ex-wife. With Hill gone, Kearney started sleeping around with other men, diving deeper into the gay scene. He also tried marriage for a bit, didn't take, and after the divorce, he returned to California to take that engineering job at Hughes Aircraft. According to Kearney's later confessions, spring of 1962 marked his first kill, a hitchhiker in Orange County, California. He talked the man into riding out with him on his motorcycle to a remote spot near Indio. Once they got there, he shot him in the head and sexually assaulted the body. The second victim was almost too tragic to believe. He was the first guy's 16-year-old cousin, desperately searching for his missing relative after watching him ride off with a stranger. Kearney saw his opening, played the helpful Samaritan, offered to drive the kid around looking for his cousin. Same location, same gunshot, same violation. The first murder that would actually stick to him in court came around Christmas 1968, right there in his own home. He and Hill had patched things up, moved to Culver City. That day he lured a man named George up from San Diego, brought him back to the house, and while they were together, he shot him dead. Dragged the body to the bathroom, had sex with it, then went to work with an X-Acto knife, skinning and dismembering the corpse. In order to cover his tracks, he dug the bullet out of George's skull, buried the pieces behind the garage. But he was just getting started. These early kills were practice runs. By June 1971, he'd refined his craft into something almost industrial. John Demchick accepted a ride from him. He drove Demchick to some isolated stretch and killed him. Demchick's remains weren't found until February 1973. At first, they figured Demchick was just another undocumented Mexican who'd crossed the border and vanished. Then the coroner took a closer look. One bullet, left ear in, lodged in the right cheek. The signature shot, the one Kearney's father had taught him, right above the ear, clean and efficient. September 1973. 17-year-old James Fletcher Barwick hitched a ride with Kearney. His body turned up that same day. When the coroner cut him open, they found semen in his rectum, meaning this kid suffered one final violation before he died. From 1974 onward, Kearney was practically on a monthly schedule. He'd cruise the highways and gay bar strips in his Volkswagen Beetle or pickup truck hunting. Once someone got into his car, it was right hand on the gun, left hand on the wheel, waiting for an opportunity to kill, all the while maintaining just the right speed to avoid attracting attention. After the kill, he'd drive to some desolate spot to have sex with the body. Then came the hacksaw, the industrial trash bags, the dumps in canyons, landfills, along the freeway. That's how he got the name, the trash bag killer. Sometimes he'd leave corpses in the desert for the vultures and coyotes. Sometimes he'd beat the corpses, working out years of pent-up rage and bitterness. He told police the killings excited him, gave him that rush of dominance. Just thinking about sexually hurting someone, killing them, that got him off. Although Kearney primarily targeted young men, his victims also included children and teenagers. Among them was 5-year-old Ronald Smith. August 24, 1974, Ronald went missing in Lenox, California. That day, Ronald had begged his grandmother to let him go play at Lenox Park. At the park, Ronald got into an argument with his friends and decided to leave on his own. On his way home, Kearney's car pulled up in front of Ronald, and he lured Ronald into the car under the pretext of going for a drive. Along the way, Kearney took Ronald to McDonald's to grab a bite to eat, complaining that he was starving. However, that meal at McDonald's turned out to be his last. On October 12, 1974, Ronald's body was found alongside Ortega Road in Riverside County. His ankles were bound with underwear and semen was detected in his rectum. On June 16, 1976, 13-year-old Michael was murdered. The teenager from Redondo Beach had a long history of juvenile delinquency. According to Kearney's testimony, he happened to run into Michael near Inglewood Avenue as Michael was trying to hitchhike to Torrance. Then Kearney explained why he killed the boy. Michael kept bragging about his criminal history, kept asking where the burglar alarm was in Kearney's house. He concluded that the boy posed a potential threat, so he shot him. During police questioning, Kearney said, "I disposed of the body. You'll never find him." To this day, Michael's remains are still out there somewhere. His final victim was 8-year-old Merle Chance, a kid from the Venice neighborhood. On April 6, 1977, Chance was riding his bicycle near Kearney's workplace. Kearney stated that after killing Chance, he took the boy's body home to keep it overnight, and only the next day did he dispose of it in the Angeles National Forest. The one who finally ended it all was 17-year-old John LeMay. On March 13, 1977, around 5:30 p.m., John told his neighbor he was heading to Redondo Beach to meet someone from the gym, a guy named Dave. Dave was Hill. When John rang the bell, Hill wasn't home, only Kearney. Kearney played the gracious host, told John to watch TV while he waited for Dave, and then he pulled his gun and put a bullet in the back of John's head. 5 days later, John's body was found. But here's the thing. John had told his neighbor where he was going, so the police followed the trail and actually knocked on Kearney's door before Merle Chance was killed. During that visit, Kearney and Hill realized word about John was out. Then Kearney pivoted, confessed their gay relationship to the deputies, played the frightened lovers card, claimed they were terrified of becoming victims themselves. That half-truth performance was good enough. The police bought it, snipped a few carpet fibers for comparison, and walked away. After that first visit, the police ran the fibers they'd collected against the green threads investigators had pulled from the nylon tape sealing the garbage bag around John's body. Perfect match. But they'd screwed up the collection procedure, chain of evidence issues, so they needed to go back and do it right. On May 3rd, they showed up again, this time officially extracting carpet samples, demanding hair and biological specimens from both Kearney and Hill. And that's when they stumbled onto something else, a hacksaw crusted with dried blood. The lab results came back like a nightmare. Carpet fibers from John's body, identical to Kearney's living room carpet, blood on the saw, John's blood type. The pieces were falling into place, and by June 3rd, the arrest warrants were signed. But Kearney had already smelled it coming. He'd written his grandmother in Barstow weeks earlier, instructed her to sell the house, settle the bills, told her he was moving. On May 26th, he and Hill bolted to El Paso, Texas. But it didn't stick. After enough phone calls from family, Kearney decided to turn himself in. July 1st, the two of them walked into the Riverside County Sheriff's Office. Kearney walked straight to a wanted poster on the wall and said, "We're them." Later, Hill was cleared of suspicion and proven to have no connection to Kearney's crimes, as Kearney had committed his crimes only when they had argued and he had left home. Thus, Hill regained his freedom. But Kearney, his real trial was just beginning. Facing questioning from investigators, he chose to make a full confession. At first, he admitted to 28 murders, then added 7 more, bringing the total to 35 lives taken. In order to save his life, Kearney cut a deal, full confession in exchange for his life. Prosecutors charged him with 21 murders. He pleaded guilty to all of them, got 21 consecutive life sentences. The police knew the other 7 he admitted to were real too, but without physical evidence, those cases just sat there, technically unsolved, forever in limbo. September 2025, Kearney's still rotting at Mule Creek State Prison. Never made parole, never will. Judge Paul Breckenridge Jr. got his wish, the one he voiced at sentencing. That cold fury barely contained. "I would only hope that the Community Release Board will never see fit to parole Mr. Kearney because he appears to be an insult to humanity. I think I killed her through them." When asked by the judge to explain his motive for murder, 47-year-old Carroll stood in the courtroom and said, "Carroll was one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. By that time, he had confessed to killing 14 women, including his wife. However, behind these murders lay a long, vicarious revenge that had begun in childhood. I think I killed her through them." This sentence was Carroll's most representative statement and the core explanation of his own murderous motive. The her he spoke of was his mother, the woman who had made his childhood miserable. He saw every woman unfaithful to family and love as a stand-in for his mother. By strangling them, he fantasized about achieving his revenge against her. Strangle them was to strangle her. On May 9, 1938, an ordinary family in Sioux City, Iowa, welcomed their second son. The father, Cole, was a hardworking laborer, and the mother, Vesta, was a homemaker. They named the boy Carroll. Unfortunately, in those days, the Great Plains of the Midwest suffered from severe drought and dust storms. Most families moved to California, and Carroll's family was no exception. They moved to Richmond. There, Cole found work in a shipyard. However, not long after that, the outbreak of World War II tore the family apart. Cole received his draft notice and was forced to leave for the front lines. During the time Cole was away from the family, Carroll's childhood nightmare began. In those days, many women left behind faced problems of emotional loneliness, economic pressure, and social temptation, and Vesta was one of them. Faced with these problems, Vesta, the mother left at home, the mother who needed to care for her children, began one cheat after another. What was unbelievable was that her cheating was not in the ordinary sense, for she forced the young Carroll to accompany her to her cheating place, hotel rooms, back seats of cars, strangers' apartments. She threatened him with violence to keep her secret. "If you tell your father, and then I will beat you to death." Beyond this, Vesta also subjected Carroll to a lot of emotional abuse, especially gender humiliation. She forced Carroll to wear frilly dresses and petticoats, dressing him up to look like a girl, and made him serve as mommy's little girl at parties for female guests to mock. After entering school, Carroll, a name that was almost universally mistaken for feminine at the time, made him the target of bullying by his peers. They mocked him as a sissy, a fake girl, mommy's little girl. In the end, these painful experiences led Carroll to develop a pathological hatred with unfaithful women, along with severe gender identity trauma and sexual psychological distortions. Carroll later said, "The kids teased me and it hurt. I felt hostility, and I retreated more and more into myself." In 1946, when he was only 8 years old, Carroll drowned his classmate Owen, who had mocked him, in the water at Richmond's yacht harbor. Owen's last words before dying were, "What's it like having a girl's name, Carroll?" At the time, the police hastily ruled Owen's death an accidental incident, and the truth of this murder would not be revealed until decades later, when Carroll disclosed it in his autobiography written in prison. In an interview, Carroll said, "I was primed. I had made the mental commitment I was going to get even with my mother, and things just built up and became an obsession." In 1957, after graduating from high school, Carroll joined the United States Army. However, he was dishonorably discharged in 1958 for misconduct after stealing a pistol and firing at vehicles on the highway. 1 year later, he attacked two couples parked in cars on a lover's lane. Shockingly, shortly after the attacks, Carroll voluntarily flagged down a Richmond police officer, stating that he wished to turn himself in. He confessed that he had long been tormented by violent fantasies of strangling women. It can be said that, apart from the murder in his childhood, Carroll was the first serial killer in history to warn the police before committing his series of murders. However, none of the policemen believed his words. Over the following 3 years, Carroll was merely placed in psychiatric hospitals without receiving effective restraint or treatment. In the final stage of his stay at Stockton State Hospital, a doctor named Weiss left a remarkably prescient diagnostic record. He seems to be afraid of the female figure and cannot have intercourse with her first, but must kill her before he can do it. Although Dr. Weiss had already diagnosed Carroll with antisocial personality disorder, in April 1963, he approved Carroll's release. After several years of observation, he had ultimately concluded that Carroll's condition posed no threat to others, convinced that Carroll was merely using threats of violence to obtain free room and board. What he did not know at the time was that a dangerous person who clearly expressed his fantasy of killing and had been diagnosed with severe personality disorder was sent back to society by his hand. After leaving the psychiatric hospital, Carroll moved to Dallas, Texas, where he sought refuge with his older brother, Richard. There, he met and married an alcoholic stripper named Billy. This marriage did nothing to change Carroll's pathological hatred of women. Instead, it made him more violent and paranoid. In 1965, after he got the idea that Billy was cheating on him, he set fire to a motel. In the end, he and Billy's marriage broke down, and he was arrested and sent to prison for arson. After serving his sentence, Carroll attempted to strangle an 11-year-old girl in Missouri. He had sneaked into her bedroom while she was sleeping and tried to choke her. This case led to his second arrest and a 5-year prison sentence. However, prison life did nothing in terms of rehabilitation. As Carroll himself later admitted, "If anything, I got worse." Following this release, Carroll headed to Nevada, where he once again attempted to strangle 2 women. Incredibly, Carroll chose to voluntarily commit himself to a psychiatric hospital yet again, once more revealing his homicidal fantasies to doctors. Tragically and outrageously, although the doctors clearly noted Carroll's mental condition and diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, alcoholism, compulsive behavior involving the strangling and raping of women, they chose not to notify the police to detain him, just simply bought him a bus ticket back to San Diego. This was Carroll's final explicit cry for help to the judicial and medical systems before he embarked on his series of murders. Yet once again, he was dismissed as someone merely trying to obtain free room and board. On May 7, 1971, 33-year-old Carroll encountered 39-year-old Louise in a bar. The two hit it off, and he then invited Louise to his car for what he promised would be a beautiful encounter. However, once inside the car, Carroll suddenly attacked, clamping his hands around Louise's throat and strangling her until she was completely dead. Just 2 weeks later, Carroll killed again. The identity of the second victim remains unknown. During later interrogations, Carroll explained his motive for these crimes. Those women had all been unfaithful to their husbands, and they were like the mother who had repeatedly committed adultery during his childhood and brought him such humiliation. In July 1973, Carroll married a barmaid named Diana, but this relationship was unhappy from the start. Both of them were heavy alcoholics, and arguments and physical altercations were routine in their household. So Carroll frequently ran away from home. However, Carroll's runaway was actually looking for his prey around the city. During those days, Carroll committed multiple murders, including one in Oklahoma City in 1977. He claimed that when he woke up, the woman was already dead in the bathtub, her feet and arms placed in the refrigerator, and flesh carved from her buttocks sitting in a frying pan on the stove. In September 1979, following a violent argument, Carroll strangled Diana to death. He wrapped her body in a blanket and stuffed it into a closet. 8 days later, a neighbor, noticing that Diana had not been seen for several days, chose to call the police. When the police arrived, they found Diana's remains in the closet, and the crime scene clearly indicated homicide. However, inexplicably, because the medical examiner detected that Diana's blood alcohol concentration was 4 times the legal limit, he hastily ruled her cause of death as alcohol poisoning, directly resulting in Carroll being released without charge after police questioning. Later, Carroll went to Las Vegas. There, he met Mary in a bar, and that very night, the two of them went to a motel and had sex. Then Carroll strangled Mary to death. Several weeks later, Carroll traveled to Dallas. In November 1980, within the span of a single month, he strangled 3 women to death in succession. In the second murder case, he was a suspect of the police. At the crime scene of the third case, he was arrested by the police on the spot. The victim of the third case was 43-year-old Thompson. At that time, Thompson's children had come to visit her. However, the person who opened the door for them was Carroll, who was drinking whiskey, while Thompson lay face down on the sofa, naked from the waist down. Carroll told the police that Thompson had invited him to her home to have sex, but the police found no evidence that Thompson had been sexually assaulted. Ironically, just as Carroll was about to be eliminated as a suspect due to insufficient evidence, Carroll voluntarily confessed to his crimes. He confessed that over the past 9 years, at least 14 women had died at his hands. He added that the actual number might be even higher, but because he was usually intoxicated when he committed his crimes, many details had long since been forgotten. For example, during his later trial, when describing the Oklahoma City murder, he said, "This one is almost a complete blank. Evidently I'd done some cooking the night before. There was some meat on the stove in a frying pan and part that I hadn't eaten on a plate on the table." On April 9, 1981, Carroll was convicted of the 3 murders in Texas and sentenced to life imprisonment. In January 1984, upon learning of the death of his mother Vesta, Carroll's attitude underwent a marked transformation. He agreed to face additional murder charges brought by the state of Nevada, even though that meant he would be sentenced to death, and he did so nonetheless. In February 1984, Carroll was extradited to Nevada, where he was tried and convicted of the 2 murders committed in 1977 and 1979. In October, the Nevada court sentenced Carroll to death. When the sentence was pronounced, he addressed the judge, "Thanks." Before his execution, Carroll spent the time quietly, granting permission for a Las Vegas neurosurgeon to study his brain after death, in an effort to explain his violent life. The American Civil Liberties Union, the United Methodist Church of Reno, and several death row inmates jointly petitioned for Carroll's sentence to be commuted, seeking to spare him from the death penalty. However, their actions were met with Carroll's stern refusal. Carroll stated, "Prolonging my life would be a waste of taxpayers' money. I have made such a mess of my life that I do not wish to continue." At 2:10 a.m. on December 6, 1985, 47-year-old Carroll was executed by lethal injection at the Nevada State Prison. Freeway Phantom case were a series of serial killings that occurred in the early 1970s. Between April 1971 and September 1972, 6 black girls, aged between 10 and 18, went missing in Washington, D.C. When there were no consequences for murder, the Phantom only became bolder and more ruthless. When kidnapping the 3rd victim, he made her call her family and tell them that a white man picked her up and she's heading home in a cab. In the pocket of the 5th victim was a provocative note that read, "I will admit the others, when you catch me if you can." Faced with these young lives, the police department, which was almost entirely white at the time, asked the victims' families prejudiced questions. Why were they on the streets at night? Why were they dressed provocatively? In that period of severe racial discrimination, the color of the victim's skin was one of the key factors hindering the discovery of the truth. Nearly 50 years have passed. Forensic technology has advanced significantly, resulting in the arrest of several serial killers whose crimes had previously gone unsolved. However, due to the mistake made by investigators, forensic evidence and case files were accidentally destroyed. So, the Freeway Phantom case, the first known serial killer case in Washington, D.C., remains buried deep in the archives to this day. Who's the Phantom? What's his motive? No one knows the answers. The first victim of the Freeway Phantom case was Carroll. She lived in a community in southeast D.C., was one of 8 children in her family, raised by a single mother named Thompson. On the evening of April 25, 1971, Carroll was sent by her sister to the 7-Eleven, half a mile away from their home, to buy some food. But a half hour later, when she should have finished her shopping and returned home, she did not come back. With each passing second, Carroll's 7 siblings and Thompson became more and more anxious. Thompson called the police, but the officer gave the standard response: she might have run away from home. The little girl was close to her family and had never considered running away, something all the family members knew. Realizing that the officer could not offer help, Thompson immediately organized a search party with friends and neighbors. They searched the community and the vicinity of the convenience store for hours. Unfortunately, there was no result. On May 1st, just 6 days later, the worst news came to Carroll's family. The officer found a body behind St. Elizabeth's Hospital near Interstate 295, and that was Carroll. The forensic report stated that the victim had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. In addition, undigested food was also found in her stomach, which meant, for most of the time she was missing, she had been held captive somewhere by the murderer. Just as the police were preparing to conduct a thorough investigation into the case, social upheaval suddenly disrupted all their plans. In 1971, anti-war sentiment was running high in the United States. A large number of anti-war demonstrators poured into Washington, D.C., chanting, "If the government won't stop war, we'll stop the government." Faced with such a massive demonstration, the police were forced to act. Romaine, the detective investigating Carroll's murder, was also affected. Her superior ordered her to stop working on Carroll's case and focus on maintaining social order instead. Then, the investigation into Carroll's murder came to a standstill. More than 2 months later, an officer found the body of a girl on an embankment near the Interstate 295, just 15 feet away from where Carroll's body had been found. Under the scorching July sun, the body had severely decomposed, with the face unrecognizable and making the cause of death difficult to determine. Later, the victim's identity was confirmed by her family. She was 16-year-old Johnson, a girl who had just started a summer job and who lived in the same community as Carroll. On the morning of July 8th, she left home as usual to start her shift at the Oxon Hill Recreation Center. However, even though it was after working hours, she still hadn't returned home. Her anxious mother immediately called the police to report her daughter missing, but as in the Carroll case, they responded that she might have run away. Following Johnson's death, Carroll's family was certain that the police would uncover more information about Carroll's murderer. But just 8 days after Johnson's body was found, on the afternoon of July 27th, Brenda was sent by her mother to a grocery store a block and a half away from their home. However, by the time it was completely dark, Brenda still had not returned home. Worried that Brenda might have got lost, her mother went straight to the grocery store, leaving Bertha, who was 7 years old, and their stepfather at home. At around 9:20 p.m., while waiting for her sister and mother to return, Bertha received a phone call. It was Brenda, saying that a white man had picked her up and she is heading home in a cab, but she felt that she had left Washington, D.C. and went to Virginia. Several minutes later, the phone rang again. It was the stepfather who answered. Brenda, crying, told him that she was inside a house with a white man and was confused about what was going to happen next. The stepfather demanded to speak to the man, then there was a sound of heavy footsteps on the phone. Hearing the footsteps, Brenda said, "I'll see you." At 5 a.m. the following day, Brenda's body was found by a hitchhiker in a prominent location on the U.S. Route 50 near the Baltimore-Washington Parkway in Prince George's County, Maryland. As with the first 2 victims, she had been sexually assaulted and strangled, and her shoes were missing. On October 1st, 12-year-old Yates was sent by her father to a Safeway store just 1 block away from their home. She bought some food and left the store, and less than 3 hours later, her body was found on the shoulder of Pennsylvania Avenue in Prince George's County. She had also been sexually assaulted, strangled, and her shoes were missing. As the cases continued to unfold, The black community's frustration with the slow progress of the police investigation gradually intensified. The tense atmosphere was further exacerbated by media coverage, with newspaper headlines filled with questions about the cases. What exactly happened? What measures have the police taken? Some media outlets began to speculate that these murders might be the work of a serial killer who used Interstate 295 to track down his victims and escape, as all the victims were found near the freeway. So they called the murderer Freeway Phantom. Initially, however, the police did not believe there was a connection between these murders. When they were unable to solve the cases, the FBI joined forces with all law enforcement agencies to form a task force. They began assisting in the forensic investigation and conducting a collective inquiry into the murders. After re-examining evidence from the victims' remains, task force investigators discovered a crucial clue. Forensic experts found hair that did not belong to the victims in the underwear of 3 of them. The hair was from a black person and did not belong to the victims themselves. As more details were found, the investigators finally linked the 4 murders together. They were almost certain that the murderer was black man. A witness to the second murder reported seeing Johnson sitting in a black car driven by a black man after she disappeared. The 2 phone calls Brenda made were forced by the murderer. He deliberately provided inaccurate information, such as claiming a white man had taken her and she was in Virginia, in order to buy time and mislead the investigation. Shortly thereafter, however, the 5th victim emerged. On November 16th, an officer found Woodard's body near Prince George's County Hospital on Baltimore-Washington Parkway. Unlike the other victims, her shoes were still on her feet and she was wearing a coat draped over her chest. Inside one of the coat pockets was a note that read, "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me if you can." The note was signed by the Freeway Phantom. "I'm scared for myself and worried for all the little girls that come after," Brenda's sister Bertha said. Romaine remarked everyone was reporting suspects to the police station. Priests, police officers, doctors. Every man you could think of had been a suspect at some point. Just as the investigation was in full swing, the murders stopped. Perhaps the involvement of FBI and the intense media attention had frightened the Phantom, causing him to halt his killing spree, but only temporarily. 10 months later, on September 5, 1972, Diane, 17-year-old, left her boyfriend's house in Southeast D.C. and never returned home. "I remember the night she didn't come home. I couldn't sleep all night," Diane's sister recalled. The next morning, the officer found her body near Interstate 295. Unlike the other victims, although she had been strangled, she had not been sexually assaulted, and her shoes were still there. By this point, all 6 victims of the Freeway Phantom case had been identified: Carroll, Johnson, Brenda, Yates, Woodard, and Diane. During the investigation, the investigators, due to the victims' ages, had tried to link known pedophiles and sex offenders to the murders, but no result. As time went on with no suitable suspects, viable leads, and due to the victims' race, the priority of other cases gradually increased. The Freeway Phantom case faded from the public eye, and the task force was disbanded. However, it continued to haunt the investigators who were eager to solve the case and the victims' families. Barry, the retired FBI agent who had been part of the task force, recalled, "You never lose interest in this case. What you had seen and what you had learned about the deaths of these girls was so upsetting. What had happened to that person to make him hate so much that the only way to make that hate go away is to watch some little girl die in front of him." In 1987, after Romaine was promoted to sergeant, she decided to reopen the investigation into the Freeway Phantom case. She wanted to start by reviewing the case files and forensic evidence from back then. However, the initial investigators, believing that the Freeway Phantom case was outdated and no longer important, had destroyed forensic evidence and case files. This mistake was also one of the key reasons why the case remained unsolved for so long. Freeway Phantom case had a gang of suspects and a significant suspect. The gang, known as the Green Viga Rapists, is believed to be connected to multiple sexual assaults and kidnappings in Washington, D.C. and surrounding areas of Maryland. In order to learn more about the Green Viga Rapists, 3 investigators, Fickling, Irving, and Richardson, visited Lorton Prison and interviewed several members of the Green Viga Rapists. During one of these interviews, an anonymous gang member claimed that another gang member had confessed to him about involvement in the Freeway Phantom case and shared details about one of the murders. Since the confessing gang member was also incarcerated in Lorton Prison, he would only provide more information if he could remain anonymous to protect himself from being implicated. Later, 3 investigators reached an agreement with him. In order to verify the authenticity of his claims, the member disclosed details of the murders that had not been made public and were known only to the murderer and the police. Just as the investigation was on the verge of a breakthrough, however, Maryland was holding elections at the time. One of the candidates publicly announced to the media that there had been a breakthrough in the Freeway Phantom investigation, claiming that an inmate in Lorton Prison had provided relevant information. Realizing that he had been exposed to the public, the anonymous member refused further interviews and denied ever communicating with the investigators. The significant suspect was a computer technician named Robert, 58-year-old. In March 1977, Robert was charged with kidnapping and raping a woman at his home in Washington, D.C. Subsequently, an investigator named Davis interrogated him and found that he had been previously charged with multiple murders. On December 28, 1938, aged 19, Robert had served whiskey laced with cyanide to 5 women at a brothel, resulting in the death of 31-year-old Ruth. 2 days later, on December 30th, he stabbed another woman, 26-year-old Elizabeth, at the same location. After his arrest, Robert was detained at Gallinger Hospital for psychiatric observation. There, he broke free from his restraints and attacked 3 orderlies with a chair. In April 1952, he strangled 42-year-old Lavra to death. Robert was suspected of being the Phantom because he fit the FBI's behavioral profile and had been charged with multiple murders. In 1990, an FBI criminal analyst completed a behavioral profile of the Freeway Phantom based on old case materials and conversations with investigators. The profile indicated that the murderer was most likely a psychopathic woman hater, aged between 27 and 32, who had possibly lived or worked in Southeast DC, and was likely to have been acquainted with several of the victims. The behavioral profile seemed tailor-made for Robert. He was psychopathic woman hater, and his daughter was friends with some of the victims. But his modus operandi was entirely different from that of the Phantom. He used poisoning, stabbing, and strangulation. His choice of victims also differed. The women he killed were all over 20 years old. More crucially, after the Freeway Phantom case began, Robert was investigated and polygraphed, and his backyard was searched by the police, but no evidence was found. Freeway Phantom case, the only way to crack now would be for someone to come forward with new information or for usable DNA to be found, and then the same techniques used to catch the Golden State Killer, modern forensic genealogy, could be employed to apprehend the long-hidden Phantom. Back in the 1990s, in Greensboro, North Carolina, the corpses of 6 black women turned up, one after another, in forgotten corners of the city. But because they were drug users, sex workers, their deaths, brutal as they were, some dismembered, some decapitated, barely stirred the waters. The local police acted very slowly, saying that the risk was only part of their job. In the early days of the investigation, they divided the murder cases into isolated cases and investigated them separately. Even when they had no clue, they arrested an innocent person with weak evidence. Meanwhile, the real killer, Robert Alston, kept right on going. It wasn't until 1994, when he was locked up for assaulting and attempting to rape a 29-year-old woman, that the police finally connected the dots. Same methods: abduction, sexual assault, strangulation, dumping the corpse. The core of this case isn't just police indifference, it's that the story only got a flicker of attention in 2016, when a journalist named Nancy McLaughlin sat down with Robert for a prison interview. In April 1991, 23-year-old Joanne Robinson was last seen on the streets of Greensboro climbing into a car. Joanne was a black woman addicted to crack cocaine, and to scrape together money for her next fix, she had ended up working the streets. Just like the police said, it's just part and parcel of their job. Several days later, her naked body was found just a few blocks from her home. Joanne's death didn't attract much attention. Sex workers continued to solicit customers on the streets for sexual services. On June 23rd, the sexually assaulted body of 35-year-old Cheryl Mason was discovered. A few months later, in October, 26-year-old Sharon Martin was reported missing. Like Joanne, Martin was a street sex worker deep in the grip of drugs. But her killer wasn't finished after strangling her. He decapitated her, dismembered her, and scattered her remains across multiple areas of Greensboro. 3 women died in quick succession, the third of them being butchered and decapitated. It was only then that the Greensboro police finally took action. However, their manpower and budget were extremely limited at the time, and the cases of Joanne, Mason, and Martin had initially been treated as isolated incidents. That attitude ground the investigation to a crawl, and nothing of real value ever surfaced. 19-year-old Shamka Warren was a girl being eaten alive by addiction. In May 1992, her family reported her missing. Maybe they prayed she had just wandered off, that she'd find her way back. But by July, police found her naked, decapitated body in a vacant lot. 2 months later, on September 22nd, in a wooded area, the sexually assaulted body of Denise Robinson was discovered. Then, March 1993, a man named Larry Darby Jr. was arrested, branded the sole suspect in 5 murders. After his arrest, he insisted he was innocent, said over and over, "I ain't killed nobody." After DNA testing proved Darby right, the reason for the police's arrest of him was also opened. The evidence of their arrest of him was as thin as paper, with almost nothing, except that he happened to be near the crime scene and some vague witness narratives. 41-year-old Lois Williams was the last known victim of the Greensboro serial killings. She had once been a manager at the News and Record, a respectable job, a normal life, but crack cocaine sank its hooks into her, cost her the job, cost her everything, until she too was working the streets. On December 14, 1993, police found her body at Piedmont National Cemetery. In subsequent interviews with witnesses, investigators got a crucial piece of information. The last time Williams was seen alive, she was with a black man, roughly 6 feet tall, about 185 pounds. In January 1994, in Guilford County, North Carolina, a 29-year-old woman was standing by the road trying to hitch a ride, and Robert pulled up in a dark blue Pontiac, told her he could take her back to Greensboro. But that car never headed for Greensboro. Instead, he drove her to a forested area near the James Benson Dudley High School, where he attacked her, beat her, raped her, and then threw her off a bridge into the waters of a nearby river. Robert's arrest came down to his own carelessness. What he didn't know was that the victim survived. A few passers-by found her barely clinging to life and rushed her to hospital. She told police everything: a black man in a dark blue Pontiac, the woods, the assault. At the station, investigators showed her a photo lineup, men with records, men on their suspect list, and she picked out Robert Alston. In reality, after 6 women were dead, Robert wasn't arrested for murder. He was picked up for an assault and attempted rape. But investigators had already had him on their radar for a while. Many of the victims were found near his home, and his build matched the witness description: 6 feet tall, close to 200 pounds. They just couldn't pin him down, not without hard evidence. But the survivor's identification finally cracked the case open. On January 28, 1994, police arrested Robert, confirmed as the hitchhiker's attacker. In the interrogation room, maybe it was some warped need to show off, to feel important, he voluntarily confessed to killing Williams, that 41-year-old former manager. On April 18th, the court handed down its verdict. Based on his confession, he received his first life sentence for Williams's murder. After he went inside, Robert stayed quiet about the rest. Prior to 1996, he kept denying any connection to the deaths of Joanne, Martin, and Warren. Then, in 1996, he reached out to the prosecutor's office on his own and admitted he had strangled 23-year-old Joanne. On August 19, 1996, the courtroom convened again. Robert was charged, convicted, and handed a second life sentence. Toward the end of 1997, he contacted the prosecutor's office once more. This time, he claimed responsibility for the murders of Martin and Warren. Even though investigators hadn't found any direct evidence linking him to those 2 cases, he was still sentenced to his 3rd and 4th life terms on September 3, 1998. At sentencing, Robert described in a tone that bordered on mockery how he had strangled those women, how he had dismembered their corpses, not a trace of remorse. When the judge and Warren's mother begged him to reveal where the remaining body parts were hidden, he refused. He said, "I have had time to search my soul. What I did was wrong, and I've made peace with God. Only me and God will have those answers." Since his conviction, Robert has been shuffled between prisons across the state. Beyond the 4 murders he was convicted of, he remains the prime suspect in the killings of Denise and Mason, though neither case was ever prosecuted and both remain officially unsolved. In the mid-2010s, he granted interviews to 2 different journalists. During one of them, Robert stated that he was responsible for more than 4 murders, but was unwilling to cooperate with the Guilford County prosecutors. In another interview conducted by journalist Nancy McLaughlin, she later recalled that he just looked evil. It was then that Robert delivered his most famous and final public statement. "I won't feed anyone's fascination with my crimes. That trigger, that one thing that pushed me over the edge. I'll die with that. I don't see myself as a serial killer, but people do." Society is so quick to put monikers on people, name tags. Robert Alston, that's who I am. During his more than 30 years in prison, Robert never revealed his motive for the crime, never opened a window into his mind. In the interview, he hinted at some deep, heavy trauma, something that might explain why he did what he did, yet he swore to carry it to his grave, refusing to let scholars, journalists, anyone pick apart his psychology. However, looking at the first half of his life, he had spent it keeping everyone at arm's length. And after his arrest, his father told reporters that there was little to no emotional intimacy or trust between them. He was born in Greensboro on May 19, 1969, one of 2 children in the family. His father worked as a school custodian, his mother as a factory worker. They were poor, but nothing in Robert's upbringing shows up in the records as significant family dysfunction, no domestic violence, no broken marriage, no history of alcoholism or drug abuse. His childhood is largely a blank page until high school, when he enrolled at the local Grimsley High. Back then, teachers described him as introverted. Throughout those years, he had no close friends, no prom date, no real connection with anyone. His classmates barely remembered him. On the surface, he was a social outcast at school. After graduation, Robert headed to Georgia, enrolled in a junior college, and dropped out after his very first semester. After that, he formed a close relationship with a woman. In 1989, they had their first son, and in 1991, a second child. But shortly after the second birth, Robert suddenly clashed with his partner, abandoned both children, and moved back in with his parents in Greensboro. He was 22 that year, the same year young black women started vanishing from the streets of Greensboro. Clearly, Robert's whole life traces a steady pattern of withdrawal. From childhood straight through to adulthood, he deliberately avoided forming real emotional bonds with anyone: parents, partner, children. Beneath a family background that looked normal on paper, his extreme psychological defenses hint at some unrecorded early wound. And the absence of documented family dysfunction doesn't mean there was no trauma. Some of the most severe psychological injuries happen in families that look perfectly fine from the outside. Emotional neglect, the slow accumulation of shame. Maybe that's exactly why he refuses to explain the thing that made him collapse. In the early years of the 21st century, there was a strange smell around Ray's Sausage on Imperial Avenue in Cleveland. The smell brought discomfort to the local residents, and even the birds, which used to perch on a wire that runs near the business, stopped coming after the smell started. Something is going on. The birds stopped coming, and that was because of the smell. It was a terrible smell, one resident said. Humans are good at finding rational explanations for their fears. Since the smell was coming from the direction of Ray's Sausage, it must be spoiled meat, the sewer system, or the curing spices that had gone bad. Ray's Sausage owner even spent $30,000 to clear the pipes and clean up the sewage. At that time, no one imagined that the real problem came from the house next to Ray's Sausage, 12205 Imperial Avenue. On October 29, 2009, several police officers, holding an arrest warrant for a rape case, knocked on the door of the house. When no one answered from inside the house, they broke down the door. At the time, the house was empty. But after searching the house, the officers found 2 female remains in a bedroom on the 3rd floor. The subsequent search was like opening Pandora's box. 4 sets of remains were buried in the crawl space of the basement. More bones were buried in the backyard, and they even found a human skull inside a plastic bucket. Over the course of more than 2 years, the remains of 11 women had been hidden in the same house. What was most chilling was that the smell of decomposition had permeated the entire community for years, yet the neighbors had assumed it was a problem with Ray's sausage. Beyond that, what was most disheartening was the conduct of the local police, who repeatedly received missing persons reports from the families of the victims, yet time and again they chose to ignore them. "If they're using drugs, they'll come back when they're ready," one police officer said. The killer was called Anthony Sowell, had served in the Marine Corps, and appeared to be an ordinary neighbor. No one could have imagined the darkness of Sowell's inner world, or that his house would become a tomb for black women, drug addicts, and marginalized people. On August 19, 1959, Sowell was born in East Cleveland, ranking 3rd among 7 siblings. Sowell's mother, Garrison, was a single mother who raised all these children alone. Sowell's childhood was filled with extreme abuse and violence, but the main victim was not him. Rather, he was one of the perpetrators. Sowell's niece, Davis, recalled that Garrison frequently subjected the children to physical abuse, especially her. On one occasion, Garrison forced her to strip naked in front of the other children and whipped her with an electrical cord until her skin was torn open and bleeding. Even worse, from the age of 10, Sowell raped Davis almost daily for 2 years. On January 24, 1978, 18-year-old Sowell joined the Marine Corps. He served a total of 7 years and was officially discharged on January 18, 1985. During his 7-year Marine Corps career, he did not display any bad habits or behavioral issues. However, in 1989, his violent tendencies were exposed to the justice system. That year, a woman who was 3 months pregnant was attacked by him with binding and asphyxiation as she attempted to leave his home. He tied her hands and feet with neckties and belts and stuffed a cloth into her mouth to gag her. The woman later said, "He choked my neck forcefully. My body started to go numb. I thought I was going to die." In 1990, Sowell was formally charged with kidnapping, rape, and attempted rape. In the end, he was guilty to attempted rape and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. In 2005, Sowell left his prison and worked in a factory. After being fired in 2007, he began receiving government welfare benefits and scavenging scrap metal throughout the community to sell for a living. Sowell was a friendly guy. He had a big smile and he liked to sit on the porch and slowly sipping King Cobra, sometimes bringing a few girlfriends home. "He just looked like an ordinary person," one neighbor said. "He would play chess in the front yard and host barbecue parties in the summer, inviting everyone to join." However, Sowell had a serious need to be in control and dominant. He signed up to an online dating service, presenting himself as a master seeking submissive partners for discipline and training. During this time, he got romantically involved with Lori, who was the niece of the then Cleveland mayor Frank Jackson, and let her move in with him at his house. Lori later said that Sowell's house often had a bad smell. When she asked him about it, he would just say it was his stepmother downstairs or that it was problems from the Ray's sausage. In 2008, Lori finally had to leave because she couldn't stand the smell anymore. She never thought that the smell was coming from dead women. Not many people have an idea of what a dead body smells like. It's a kind of gaseous, fleshy, rotten stench that's mixed with blood and tissue. When it persists, people gradually become numb to it. One investigator explained, 11 women lost their lives. They were not just numbers, they were mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends, all trying to get by in tough situations, but unfortunately, ending up as Sowell's victims. 35-year-old Crystal had been seen by her mother as a responsible child and her little mother hen. However, fate was cruel. After the death of one of her children, the pain of losing her baby plunged her into drug troubles. Sowell lured her into his home by offering her drugs, then raped and murdered her. At that time, after Crystal went missing, her family chose to report it to the police, but were ignored by them. 33-year-old Tishana went missing in 2008. Her family said that she would often bring food to homeless people living in their cars. After years of homelessness, she had finally secured a small apartment in the Woodland Hills neighborhood, yet just as her life was beginning to turn around, she was dead. In August 2008, 25-year-old Long was murdered, and in October, 45-year-old Michelle was murdered. In her youth, Michelle had made her way through New York and New Jersey, and eventually choosing to return to Cleveland to restart her life because she had been battling drug addiction for many years. However, she became Sowell's victim. One of Michelle's family said, "Someone stealing Christmas decorations can make the news, but a missing mother goes completely unnoticed." In November 2008, 52-year-old Tanya was murdered. On January 29, 2009, 44-year-old Smith was killed. In the spring of 2009, 47-year-old Hunter was murdered. In April 2009, 44-year-old Nancy was murdered. On June 3, 2009, 48-year-old Janice was murdered. Also in June, 31-year-old Fortson was murdered. In September 2009, 38-year-old Diane went missing. 11 women, 11 lives plagued by drugs, poverty, and social indifference. Among them were daughter who carefully cared for her disabled father, grandmother who devoted her whole heart to raising 5 grandchildren. They were all struggling to survive in difficult circumstances. As the prosecutor stated during the trial, Sowell specifically targeted marginalized women because he knew that the disappearance of these people would not alarm anyone. In September 2009, 50-year-old Sowell extended an invitation to Lori Billups, asking her to come to his house to smoke crack cocaine together. On September 22nd, a battered and bruised Billups walked into the Cleveland Police Department and recounted a horrifying story. After entering Sowell's home, they had a few drinks, but Sowell suddenly began beating her, strangling her throat with both hands, and raping her after she lost consciousness. Fortunately, she regained consciousness quickly. After confronting him for a while, he let her go. October 29th, several police officers, armed with an arrest warrant for the rape case, broke into Sowell's home. 2 days later, this man, known as the Cleveland Strangler, was captured while on the run, bringing his criminal career to an end. Further investigation revealed that, in addition to the 11 victims, there were 3 survivors, all of whom had been lured to his home under the pretext of using drugs together and subsequently suffered rape. And in reality, that was not the first time Sowell had been arrested by the police. As early as 10 months prior, he had been arrested due to allegations from another survivor, but was released without charge due to a detective's decision. One of the darkest investigative failures in the history of the Cleveland Police Department. On December 8, 2008, 41-year-old Gladys Wade, covered in blood, flagged down a patrol police car. She said a horrifying story to the patrol officers. Sowell had invited her inside for a drink, and when she refused, he suddenly attacked her, dragged her up to the 3rd floor, bound her with neckties and belts, and choked her until she lost consciousness. When she woke up, she found herself naked and being sexually assaulted by him. Then, she struggled free from his control and escaped through a broken glass window, her fingers bleeding profusely from the cuts. The patrol officers immediately took action. They rushed to Sowell's house and found struggle marks in the snow, blood stains on the steps, women's clothing and underwear in a trash can, and glass shards on the window, all of which confirmed that Wade was not lying. Thus, Sowell was arrested on the spot. Later, the case was transferred to the Sex Crimes and Child Abuse Unit, assigned to a detective named Georgia. But 2 days later, when Georgia reported the case to the assistant prosecutor, she explicitly stated that there were conflicts between Wade's account and Sowell's version, and that there was no evidence supporting the sexual assault allegations, resulting in Sowell being released directly. And on the very night of Sowell's release, Georgia did something utterly inexplicable. She returned to Sowell's residence alone. She saw the broken glass that Wade had described, but she did not enter the house, did not report any abnormalities, and did not inform anyone of her visit. When later questioned by attorneys as to why she returned, Georgia defended herself by claiming she wanted to examine the scene, yet insisted that this did not change her assessment of Wade's testimony. She seemed to be defending him, a victim rights attorney said, and her defense cost the lives of 5 women who came after. After his arrest, Sowell faced 11 counts of aggravated murder and 74 related charges, including rape, kidnapping, tampering with evidence, and abuse of corpses. On July 22, 2011, the jury found him guilty of 9 of the 11 murder charges. On August 10th, the jury recommended the death penalty. 2 days later, the judge adopted the recommendation and formally sentenced him to death. Later, on February 8, 2021, Sowell died at the Franklin Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio. When the police found the 11th body in Sowell's residence, his neighbors finally realized the smell they had complained about for years had not come from the Ray's sausage. The owner, Ray, testified in court saying, "Because we're in the meat business, everyone thought it was us, but when they walked into our factory, there was no smell. It was always outside." However, upon learning that the smell had come from 11 decomposing human remains, Ray did not feel any relief. He said, "Knowing the truth didn't make me feel better. It only made me feel that all of us were living 3 feet away from hell." What shocked the community residents most was the indifference of the Cleveland Police Department. The families of the missing women reported to the police multiple times, only to be told that they were drug users who would come back on their own. Residents filed complaints with the police, yet never received serious investigations. This structural neglect of marginalized groups ultimately cost the government a heavy price. In 2011, they reached a settlement with the victims' families, paying $1.3 million in compensation. In addition, the dark house was demolished, and later there was transformed into a memorial called the Garden of 11 Angels. One neighbor said, "I couldn't wait for them to tear it down. Everyone wanted it gone. It is a bad memory. I never want to see that house again." When San Francisco's Castro district was hailed as the Mecca of gay liberation on the American West Coast, a young black man, later known as the Doodler, would appear in the late hours at all-night diners or linger in the corners of gay bars, approaching solitary white gay men, usually middle-aged white guys. He would introduce himself as an art school student or a cartoonist, then pull a pen from his pocket and sketch animals on napkins or draw a portrait of his target. Like my doodles? That simple question in that artsy bohemian city was dangerously charming. That was how he built connections with these men. But it was also his trap. When he lured them to secluded beaches or parks, Ocean Beach, Golden Gate Park, Land's End, their fate was death. The Doodler, a serial killer never brought to trial, committed one of the most notorious cold cases in American history from January 1974 to June 1975. Though San Francisco Police Department officially confirmed 6 victims, some seasoned investigators believe the true death toll could be as high as 14. Unlike the infamous Zodiac Killer case, also in San Francisco, the Doodler's crimes nearly vanished from history, only resurfacing in recent years. One victim's family didn't even learn until nearly half a century later that their loved one had been murdered by someone called the Doodler. Let's be real here, the cases that grab headlines and police attention are usually the ones involving middle-class white girls, cisgender and respectable. Doodler's victims? Gay men? Back then, the San Francisco Police Department even had dedicated units to surveil and trap and systematically harass the gay community under vice laws. In the early hours of January 27, 1974, the San Francisco Police Department received an anonymous call. "I believe there may be a dead body," the caller said, "at Ocean Beach, across from Oloa Street, if you follow the street right down to the water." No one knew who the caller was, probably just a witness who didn't want any trouble. When several officers arrived at Ocean Beach, what greeted them was the sight of a male corpse lying face down on the sand. He looked to be around 50, bald, heavyset, with 16 stab wounds scattered across his back and chest, including defensive wounds on his arms. It took the police several days just to identify the victim, 49-year-old Gerald Kavanagh, a furniture refinisher from Canada, a closeted gay man living alone in Haight-Ashbury. One man was murdered and 16 people were stabbed. Today, this will be the front page news everywhere. But what about that time? Local newspapers didn't cover it much and the police didn't prioritize it. because it was the early days of gay liberation, and no one really cared about the lives of those who deviated from the norms. The police often ignore crimes against homosexuals, and they have even set up a specialized force to arrest them. One openly gay investigator later recalled, people were getting robbed, harassed, beaten. The Doodler just took it to another level. He killed them, and he got away with it because, first of all, the police honestly didn't care. And even after a second victim turned up, nothing changed. 5 months later, on June 25th, a woman out for her morning walk found a body in the bush near Spreckles Lake in Golden Gate Park. It was 27-year-old Joseph Stevens, 3 stab wounds, piercing his lungs and abdomen. There wasn't much blood at the scene. Chances are he'd crawled there alive, desperately trying to escape whoever he'd come to the lake with in those final moments of his life. But real panic didn't set in until July 7th, when a woman walking her dog, she later admitted she had nightmares for years, found Klaus Christmann at Ocean Beach. This 31-year-old German immigrant had died horrifically, his throat slashed, 15 stab wounds across his body. Christmann was different from the previous victims. He was a married father in San Francisco just to visit friends. When police found a tube of makeup in his pocket, investigators sat with that detail in silence for a long time. It hit them then. An unknown serial killer was hunting men who kept their sexuality hidden. The gay community realized it too, that someone was randomly attacking their own. So men in the Castro started warning each other, don't go off alone with strangers, especially not to Ocean Beach or Golden Gate Park. The next case came on April 27, 1975. 52-year-old postal attorney Warren Andrews was found at Land's End, his face unrecognizable. This time, the killer didn't use a knife. He beat Andrews into unconsciousness with rocks and tree branches. Andrews lingered in a hospital bed for 7 weeks before succumbing to his injuries. He never regained consciousness, never got to describe his attacker. His death wasn't officially linked to the Doodler until 2022, when his sister first heard the killer's nickname from police, nearly half a century later. On May 12th, 32-year-old Frederick Capin was found behind the sand dunes at Ocean Beach. This Vietnam veteran, a registered nurse who'd risked his life under fire to save 4 wounded Marines. His chest was stabbed multiple times, one blow slicing through his aorta. Evidence at the scene showed the Doodler had dragged his body at least 20 feet after killing him. The last confirmed victim was 66-year-old Swedish sailor Harold Goldberg. His remains discovered in the bushes at Lincoln Park Golf Course on June 4th. By then, he'd been decomposing for nearly 10 days, his face so eaten away by maggots that he was barely identifiable. There were 3 survivors in the Doodler case. Their testimonies could have been the key to arresting this killer, yet they ended up becoming silent witnesses of that era. One of them was a European diplomat. One night in July 1975, this diplomat met a young black man doodling at a restaurant. For reasons unclear, he accepted an invitation back to his apartment. There, the young man stabbed him 6 times in the back, nearly killing him. Terrified for his career and family reputation, he refused to go public, refused to testify in court. Even in 2021, when a San Francisco Chronicle reporter tried to track him down, he chose to remain silent. The second survivor lived on the same floor as the diplomat. They didn't know each other, yet both were attacked within 2 weeks. They never acknowledged one another. In those days, gay men living in the same building often deliberately avoided each other, because any connection could become evidence against them. This second survivor spent the most time with the killer. He provided police with the most detailed description of the Doodler's speech, mannerisms, and methods. The third survivor was described as a well-known entertainer, rumored to be some Hollywood celebrity. Police tried contacting him multiple times, never getting a response. The silence of these 3 survivors creates the cruelest irony of the Doodler case. They were the only ones who could identify him. Their testimony could have built the case. Yet social terror rendered them voiceless. In November 1975, based on information from the diplomat and the second survivor, police finally released a detailed sketch of the Doodler to the public. A young black man, tall and thin, around 6 feet, wearing a dark Navy-style watch cap. In their bulletin, they deliberately emphasized his preference. He liked targeting foreigners, people unfamiliar with the city. Obviously, this wasn't random. Outsiders were more dependent on strangers' kindness, sitting alone in gay bars while the Doodler sat beside them, moving in. After the sketch was released, police received 2 leads. One came from a Bay Area psychologist who claimed his patient, a gay man who'd started dating women in an attempt to correct his orientation through therapy, had possibly confessed to the murders. But investigators never confirmed this patient was the suspect, and doctor-patient confidentiality applied. Even if the psychologist had been willing to break ethics, the law wouldn't have allowed his testimony in court anyway. The second lead came from an anonymous woman who called multiple times over 10 days, providing a suspect's name and license plate, a specific, traceable identity. Even more shocking, at least 2 other people independently gave police the same name. In an era without computerized databases or cross-referencing systems, 3 separate sources pointing to the same name should have been a breakthrough. Yet police never released the name, nor explained why this lead didn't result in an arrest. Perhaps they couldn't locate the anonymous woman to get her to testify formally. In 1976, police told newspapers and made public statements that they'd interviewed a strong suspect, a young black man with a history of psychiatric treatment for sexual issues. At a 2022 press conference, they still said that same interviewed suspect remained their focus. But the central dilemma hasn't changed. Prosecuting the Doodler requires all 3 survivors to testify publicly. That means they can't remain anonymous. They have to face the defendant, the public, and the media in open court. An activist and politician who later became a major figure in San Francisco's gay rights movement said at a community meeting, "I understand their position. I respect the pressure society puts on them." What that activist basically meant was this: asking survivors to testify was asking them to become martyrs, not for justice, but for a justice system that never protected them. In those days, cops were still entrapping gay men on various charges while demanding those same men step forward for their cases. Several years ago, forensic genetic genealogy led to the arrest of the Golden State Killer after decades in hiding. Inspired by this, San Francisco police reopened the Doodler investigation. They submitted DNA samples from 2 murders for modern testing, and in 2021 they found new DNA evidence from Andrew's crime scene. Meanwhile, they raised the reward to $250,000 and released an age progression sketch of the Doodler. They say they will never give up on the case. He's a killing machine. A prosecutor said, "I don't think I have ever seen or heard of anybody who more thoroughly embodied more of what we think of as evil than Kenneth McDuff." John Moriarty, chief investigator for the Texas Department of Corrections, put it, "Kenneth is the only man in Texas history to have been sentenced to death for murder, paroled, arrested again, and convicted of murder, and then sent back to death row a second time." On March 21, 1946, Kenneth was born into a wealthy family in Rosebud, a town in central Texas. His father, John Allen, was a Freemason who had already built up a fortune in the concrete business before the construction boom of the 1960s. His mother, Addie, was a homemaker. Born the second to last child in the family, Kenneth never lacked for his family's affection from an early age, especially from his mother, Addie. Whatever his siblings had, Kenneth had to have. Whatever others didn't have, whenever he opened his mouth, Addie would unconditionally satisfy his demands. Growing up in such an environment, Kenneth gradually became accustomed to everything going his way. It was as natural to him as breathing. He never imagined air could run out. He was a hothouse orchid, bloated on attention, until the day the glass shattered. When things didn't go his way, he would become volatile and aggressive. This frequently happened when he was at school. After Kenneth entered Rosebud High School, because of his unpredictable character and what Addie did, his reputation became very bad. On the surface, Addie was a kind homemaker, but in reality, she was a woman with a violent temper. Once, because of some trivial matters, the school bus driver kicked Kenneth's twin brother, Lonnie, off the bus. When Addie learned of this, she didn't call the school to complain, nor did she seek out the principal to reason with him. She went directly to the bus driver with a gun. No one knows exactly what she said, but from then on, the bus drivers became extremely polite whenever they saw children from their family, and Addie earned herself a nickname, the Pistol-Packing Mama. Because of this nickname, Kenneth was frequently mocked by students his age, saying he was a spoiled child of a rich mother, a child of wealthy people. Over time, Kenneth responded to the verbal attacks from those students by finding Tommy, the kind of boy who was good at sports, had many friends, and was liked by teachers, and they got into a fight. However, Kenneth lost, and lost badly. Before graduating from high school, Kenneth went to work at his father's company doing manual labor. At that time, it was the 1960s, and Kenneth's father, John, was running a company related to the construction industry during the Texas construction boom. That period was Kenneth's favorite time. Even later, when he was interviewed in prison, he would always talk about those days. He said, "Those old ladies just loved the way I mowed their grass. Others were jealous." No one knows whether those old ladies' praise was real, but later records show that while he was boasting about his gardening skills, a series of burglary cases were occurring one after another in Bell County, Milam County, and Falls County. In 1964, when he was 18 years old, he was sentenced by the court for 12 counts of burglary and attempted burglary, each carrying a 4-year sentence to be served concurrently. In other words, for a young man who had just become an adult, that was a long time. However, Kenneth did not take this sentence very seriously. In December 1965, Kenneth was granted parole and returned to society early, and shortly after his release, however, he was imprisoned again for fighting. At this time, Kenneth was still just a burglar and a brawler in police records. He hadn't taken any lives, but one of his associates knew more. Roy Green later became his accomplice. He said that Kenneth loved to boast at that time, saying that he had committed far more crimes than were recorded in his file, saying that he had raped and killed 2 young women. No one knew whether what he said was true or false, but 1 year later, in 1966, the occurrence of a triple murder case made everyone have to take a fresh look at this young man. August 6, 1966, Kenneth and Green had spent all day working at a construction site, pouring concrete for Kenneth's father's company. A month earlier, Kenneth and Green had met each other through an acquaintance. The two were not close friends, but they were close enough to pass time together. After finishing work, they decided to head to Fort Worth to find something to do. Around 10 o'clock at night, after the party ended, the two were driving around aimlessly in a Dodge car, and then they drove to the local high school. Kenneth said he was looking for a girl. Green did not ask who she was, but before long, Kenneth pulled over near a local baseball field. There were 3 young people standing beside a Ford car, smoking and chatting. They were 17-year-old Robert and his 16-year-old girlfriend Sullivan, 15-year-old Mark. While they were chatting, they did not notice that a car had quietly stopped 150 yards away. Kenneth took out a .38 Colt revolver, and as he got out of the car, he told Green, "Pick up the cane and come with me." Immediately after, they walked one after another toward the 3 young people. Kenneth raised the gun and shouted, "Hand over your wallets or I'll shoot." Even after getting the wallets, however, Kenneth still ordered them to hand over the car keys and made them climb into the trunk of the Ford car. He said to Green, "I have to kill them." He drove the Ford car onto the highway, while Green followed behind in the Dodge car. Shortly after, they left the highway and stopped in a field by the roadside. The leader of the crime, Kenneth, opened the trunk and said, "I'm going to let this young lady out." He forcibly pulled Sullivan out of the trunk and signaled Green to lock her in the Dodge car. In the trunk of the Ford car, the 2 young people knelt and begged for mercy, pleading with Kenneth to spare their lives, but Kenneth had already raised his gun. He first fired 2 shots at Robert, then fired 4 shots at Mark. Then he turned and instructed Green, "Go, take that boy's shirt to wipe the fingerprints off the Ford car." After killing the 2 boys and cleaning up the fingerprints, Kenneth drove with Sullivan and Green to another secluded location. There, although Green later claimed he was forced, he and Kenneth together carried out hours of gang rape and torture on Sullivan. When they were finished, Kenneth asked Green for something that could strangle a person to death. Green unbuckled his own belt and handed it over, but Kenneth did not take it. He took out a 3-foot-long broomstick from the Dodge car. He first choked Sullivan's neck, then used the broomstick to break her neck. In the end, Sullivan's body, which had suffered hours of torture, was casually thrown into the bushes by him. Killed 3 young people, Kenneth felt no fear whatsoever. He drove to a gas station in Hillsboro, dozens of miles away, where he bought 2 bottles of Coca-Cola. The next day, after waking up, Kenneth buried the murder gun in the dirt beside the garage at Green's house. However, Green had not slept well the previous night. After worrying all night, he got up and found Richard's parents and told them exactly what Kenneth had made him do. Richard was the friend who had connected him with Kenneth. Upon hearing the news of the loss of 3 young lives, Richard's parents did not immediately call the police. They first passed the information on to Kenneth's mother, Addie, the mother who had always spoiled Kenneth. No matter how much she loved her child, knowing what her son had done, she could no longer change what had already happened. In the end, Kenneth and Green were arrested. Their trial came quickly. Kenneth was sentenced to death, while Green, having become the prosecution's main witness, was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Kenneth was sent to death row in Huntsville, where he remained safe and sound for 6 years. So why and on what basis could a criminal who had committed murder have his death sentence changed to life imprisonment and then leave death row without escaping? The reason he only spent 6 years on death row was that in 1972, the United States Supreme Court made a historic ruling in a consolidated case. They ruled that imposing the death penalty without first taking into account the nature of the crime and the characteristics of the defendant constituted cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the Constitution. In the end, all death penalty executions nationwide were suspended, and the death sentences of 629 death row inmates, including 88 death row inmates in Texas, were all commuted to life imprisonment. Later on, Kenneth's parents made many efforts for Kenneth's parole release. In addition to Addie's concern, John provided funding throughout the entire process to find ways to get Kenneth paroled. In 1977, they spent money to hire lawyers, gathered materials, and wrote multiple letters to the parole board claiming Kenneth was innocent. In 1981, they attempted to use $10,000 to bribe a man named Glenn, one of the members of the parole board, to pave the way for Kenneth's parole application. However, Glenn immediately reported this matter, and Kenneth was sentenced to an additional 2 years in prison for it. The ultimate reason why Kenneth was granted parole was the corruption within the parole system. When the time came to 1987, as everyone knows, in the 1980s, Texas prisons were already severely overcrowded, with an average of 2 to 3 prisoners housed in a single cell. So in 1987, the prison system decided to parole 750 prisoners per week. That meant the 15 members of the parole board had to interview and review the files of at least 1,000 prisoners every 5 working days. However, even if they truly wanted to study those prisoners, the prisoners' files would only contain the most basic information. They would not record what crimes they had committed, whether theft, assault, or triple murder like Kenneth's. Prosecutor Johnston said, "They were letting everybody out. It was a travesty. It was an embarrassment. And it was wrong. People were dying in the streets because of it." In 1989, Kenneth was paroled. After spending 23 years in prison, he found a job at a gas station earning $4 per hour, and at the same time, he was taking classes at Texas State Technical College. On the surface, at least, his life appeared to be on the right track, but anyone who knew about his crimes knew that his calm never lasted long. On the 3rd day after his release, a woman named Parker died. This 29-year-old woman died in Temple, 48 miles south of Waco. Her body was not found until October 14th. Soon after, he violated his parole terms in Rosebud and was sent back to prison for making death threats against a black teenager, as well as for public intoxication and driving under the influence. This time, Addie still loved her child as always. She took out $2,200 and gave it to 2 lawyers in Huntsville, hoping they would assess whether her child could be paroled again. In the end, on December 18, 1990, Kenneth was paroled once more. October 10, 1991, Brenda was standing on a street corner in Waco. She was an experienced sex worker who knew how to spot danger, but Kenneth's appearance and manner were no different from any other client. Until Kenneth roughly tied her up with rope, and she finally realized she had been kidnapped. Before long, Kenneth stopped the car because 3 police officers were checking vehicles on the road. Soon, one of the officers noticed Kenneth and walked over. At that moment, in order to be rescued, Brenda began kicking the rear windshield, even nearly shattering it. However, when the officer called for his colleagues to come over and drew his pistol, signaling Kenneth to get out of the car, Kenneth simply started the car and accelerated directly toward the 3 police officers. The 3 officers later wrote in their reports that all 3 of them had to jump aside to avoid being hit and could only watch helplessly as Kenneth drove past them, brushing by their sides. Although they reacted quickly and immediately pursued Kenneth in their patrol cars, Kenneth was a madman. In the middle of the night, he directly turned off his headlights and drove the wrong way down a one-way street. In the end, Kenneth stopped the car in the woodlands near US Route 84, where there were no lights, no witnesses, and he directly tortured Brenda to death. 5 days later, Kenneth was still in Waco. He was in a motel where he had an argument with a woman named Moore. 21-year-old Moore was also a sex worker. However, even though they had an argument, in order to make money, she still chose to get into Kenneth's car. Beside Texas State Highway 6, there was a patch of wasteland. There, Kenneth used a pair of long nylon stockings to bind Moore's hands and feet. And her remains, like Brenda's, were missing for 7 years and were not found until 1998. December 29th, in Alston, the capital of Texas, Kenneth and an accomplice were driving around. When they passed by a car wash, they saw a woman washing her car. Then, Kenneth directly got out of the car. He walked up behind that woman, choked her throat with one hand, pulled her backward with the other hand. Colleen Reed, later the police learned her name, struggled a few times, but Kenneth's strength was too great. He directly pulled her into the back seat and drove away from the scene. This kidnapping incident occurred in broad daylight, and many people at the car wash witnessed everything with their own eyes. Based on eyewitness evidence, local police quickly confirmed Kenneth as the suspect and figured out his activity patterns, finding that he was always hanging out with a former criminal named Worley. Then, Tim, a deputy sheriff, checked Worley's file and found him to have a conversation. Although the first conversation yielded nothing, Tim noticed that Worley seemed to be hiding something, because Worley's eyes wandered when he spoke and his fingers kept trembling. But he did not press Worley for answers. He simply noted down Worley's address, and in the subsequent months, he frequently drove to find Worley, sometimes bringing Worley a cup of coffee, sometimes just sitting in the car chatting casually. Over the long period of time they spent together, Worley had grown accustomed to his presence. Finally, in April 1992, Worley called him and said, "Please come over as soon as possible. There are some things that need to be discussed." 18 minutes later, Tim arrived outside the motel where Worley was staying. Worley said that when he and Kenneth were in Alston, Kenneth had kidnapped a young girl. Then, after returning to Tim's office, he recounted the complete course of events of that day. They were just going to Alston to drive around and getting high, but when Kenneth saw Colleen, Kenneth temporarily changed their plans. He kidnapped her while Worley was responsible for driving. They first drove around the neighborhood a few times, then entered the Interstate 35. Worley saw everything happening through the rearview mirror. In the backseat of the car, Kenneth used shoelaces to bind Colleen's hands, burned her with cigarettes, sexually assaulted her. Colleen kept screaming, begging Worley to stop the car, hoping he would call the police. When Tim asked Worley why he didn't seek help or try to help her, he said he was very afraid because Kenneth was in the back seat, because Kenneth had a gun in his hand. As the car drove to Bell County, Kenneth dragged Colleen out of the car, beat her until she collapsed on the ground, then stuffed her into the trunk. What happened in the end, Worley did not know, because Kenneth first drove him home, but he believed that Kenneth definitely killed and buried Colleen somewhere in Bell County. Long before investigators found Worley, Kenneth had already committed 2 more murders on his own. February 24th, 1992, a sex worker named Joshua knocked on Kenneth's door. No one knows what happened. What can be confirmed is that on that day, she was killed by Kenneth. The next victim was 22-year-old Melissa. She was working at a fast food restaurant in Waco where Kenneth had also worked. Her body was not discovered until April 26th. Kenneth's victims were scattered across various counties in Texas, such as Waco, Bell, and Travis, but each place had its own police department, its own files. They had no unified command, and therefore the investigation became extremely difficult. It was not until someone investigated that Kenneth also had 2 federal crimes of drug trafficking and possession of illegal firearms that an arrest warrant for Kenneth was issued. 4 years before 1992, a famous true crime television program premiered. This program was called America's Most Wanted. It mainly recreated crime scenes, displayed information about wanted criminals, and called on viewers to provide clues to assist law enforcement agencies in capturing fugitives. May 1st, 1992, a man named Gary Smith was at home watching America's Most Wanted. The host was talking about a serial killer from Texas, Kenneth McDuff. However, just as Kenneth's photo was being displayed, Smith noticed that Kenneth's appearance looked very similar to his new colleague, Richard. Smith worked at a garbage collection company in Kansas City. Not long ago, Richard had become his colleague. He looked like an ordinary middle-aged man, somewhat reclusive. In order to make sure he wasn't seeing things, Smith immediately found another colleague and discussed the matter with him. After discussion, Smith called the Kansas City Police Department. Later, the police looked up information on Richard and found that he had previously been arrested for soliciting sex workers and had his fingerprints taken. Then, they compared Richard's fingerprints with Kenneth's fingerprints, and the results showed that he was Kenneth. 3 days later, a surveillance team of 6 officers arrested him. On June 26th, in McLennan County, Kenneth was found guilty of 1 count of murder. The victim was Melissa. But in Texas, conviction is only the first step. The jury still needed to decide whether Kenneth would be sentenced to life imprisonment or death. Gary, a journalist, expressed the hope he would be executed, saying, "If there has ever been a good argument for the death penalty, it's Kenneth McDuff." The following years were filled with appeals, retrials, and more appeals. Kenneth's lawyers used every legal procedure available, but they were rejected by the courts one by one. In the end, his execution date was set for November 17th, 1998. In the weeks leading up to the execution, Kenneth made one of the wisest decisions of his life. He revealed the location where Colleen was buried, allowing Colleen's family to bring her remains home, rather than letting her be buried in some unknown wilderness, together with tree roots and stones. He is buried in the Captain Joe Bird Cemetery in Huntsville, Texas, where inmates lie when their families choose not to claim them. Addie, the mother who had made his bed, cooked his meals, and washed his clothes well into his adulthood, and the rest of the family who had spent a lifetime indulging and forgiving him, all refused to claim his remains. But for a man who had disappointed his family multiple times, this ending is very normal.